Hey there, tonight we're uncovering the unsettling realities of life inside a Victorian sanatorium. What you're about to discover might surprise you. Fresh air and rest weren't the only prescriptions, and the treatments were far more daunting than a Dr. Jekyll transformation. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now settle in, maybe turn on some white noise or grab your favorite blanket, and let's drift into tonight's story together. Your eyes snap open to the sound of a bell clanging with the enthusiasm of a 19th century factory whistle. Welcome to your first morning in a Victorian sanatorium, an institution with all the charm of a damp sock. This place is a far cry from the wellness retreats of today with their infinity pools and artisanal smoothies. No, here, you're treated to a regimen that screams more Victorian endurance test than health spa. Victorian sanatoriums were the brainchild of a time when the Industrial Revolution had cranked humanity up to 11. The air was thick with coal dust, and diseases like tuberculosis were just as common as top hats and monocles. In response, these institutions popped up like mushrooms after rain, promising to cure what ailed you, provided you endured a routine that was less about science and more about sheer willpower. Back in the 1800, they called this health reform. Today, we might call it morning torture. You haven't even had your first cup of coffee. Well, you won't be having one here anyway, and you're already thrust into the morning ritual that was supposed to cure you. First up, a brisk walk around the grounds, which might sound pleasant if the grounds weren't a chilly, fog-laden expanse that could double as a set for a Gothic novel. The Victorians were big on the healing powers of fresh air, even if that air was more smog than oxygen. This morning constitutional is your first taste of the cure, a concept that involves exposing yourself to nature until you either get better or lose all semblance of comfort. The sanatorium's roots dig into the rich soil of 19th century health fads. Back then, the upper crust was all about hydrotherapy, fresh air, and vegetarian diets. These were the days before antibiotics, where a dip in a cold river was just as likely to cure you as it was to give you pneumonia. The sanatorium promised to balance the body's humors through what they called natural methods. This often translated into cold showers, a diet that made gruel look like a Michelin-starred meal, and the kind of exercise regimen that would make a marathon runner balk. Once you've stumbled back inside, teeth chattering like a demented typewriter, it's time for breakfast. Hopes for a hearty meal are dashed when you're presented with a bowl of porridge, served with the enthusiasm and flavor of wet cardboard. This is not the Instagram-worthy acai bowl of your dreams. It's a stark, practical reminder that Victorian health reform equated simplicity with virtue. The thinking was that if you ate blandly, you would live purely. Unfortunately, the porridge doesn't come with a side of common sense. The allure of the sanatorium was its promise to heal not just the body, but the mind and spirit too. In an age where understanding of mental health was as foggy as a London morning, these institutions offered hope. They were, in theory, a sanctuary from the filth and fury of industrial life. But this morning routine, with its emphasis on discipline over decadence, suggests otherwise. It's a system designed more to weed out the weak than to nurture the frail. Your morning is punctuated by the occasional lecture, delivered by a doctor whose medical expertise might be overshadowed by his fervent belief in the restorative power of brisk walks and chilly showers. These talks are designed to enlighten you about the wonders of this lifestyle. Body and mind must be purified, he declares, with a certainty that makes you wonder if he's read anything beyond his own pamphlets. It's a confidence that could power a steam engine, if only it were grounded in reality. As you listen, you can't help but question the romantic view of these places as peaceful retreats. Sure, the buildings are often perched on picturesque hillsides, surrounded by nature's splendor. But the real driving force behind these institutions was economic as much as altruistic. The wealthy paid handsomely for a spot in a sanatorium, and for the operators, this was a business. The promise of specialized care and an escape from city life came with a price tag that ensured only the affluent could afford the luxury of suffering in style. The morning routine is designed to cleanse you of not just physical ailments, but of all the modern life's supposed corruptions. The thinking went that by stripping away the excesses and stresses of contemporary living, one could return to a state of pure health. It's a noble idea, but one that conveniently ignores how many patients left these places more broken than when they arrived. As the clock ticks toward noon, you realize that surviving a day in a Victorian sanatorium is a feat of endurance. The rigid routines, the Spartan diet, and the lectures on moral fortitude all combine to create an atmosphere that is more penitentiary than paradise. By lunchtime, you start to understand why so many people left these places with tales of transformation that were less about miraculous cures and more about the simple relief of escaping back to the real world. You might be here to heal, but the true cure may lie in simply making it through the day. When the lunch bell rings, you might think it's time for a break, but the sanatorium has other plans. Enter the world of hydrotherapy, where water's healing power is celebrated with all the restrained enthusiasm of a Victorian seance. Forget bubble baths. This is more like a dunk in the North Sea. Patients were subjected to a range of treatments that ranged from the mildly uncomfortable to the downright torturous, all in the name of health. First up, the cold plunge. Imagine stepping into an ice bath, except instead of recovery, you're told it's the path to wellness. This practice, often touted by those who found the invigorating chill bracing, was believed to shock the system into health. The theory was simple. Cold water would tighten the skin, invigorate the organs, and in a stroke of wishful thinking, scare away illness. It's as if the cold itself was a stern Victorian parent, scolding your body into behaving. The sanatorium's hydrotherapy menu didn't stop at cold baths. There were also steam treatments, Victorian saunas, if you will. Here, you'd sweat out impurities in a manner reminiscent of a boiled lobster. The steam rooms were cramped and stifling, designed to cleanse your pores and allegedly your soul. In theory, this was meant to help with everything from rheumatism to respiratory issues. In reality, it was a breeding ground for dehydration and fainting spells. And let's not forget the douche, not the modern kind, but a high-pressure hose that blasted water at you with the force of a fireman's hose. This wasn't about cleanliness. It was about shock. The water would hit you like a ton of bricks, promoting circulation and, according to some, spiritual awakening. It's incredible what people would endure when desperate for relief, or more accurately, when they had no other options. Hydrotherapy was big business, and sanatoriums weren't shy about charging a premium for these watery wonders. A stay could cost anywhere from £10 to £30 a week. A small fortune when you consider that the average Victorian worker earned about £40 a year. This was wellness for the wealthy, promising renewal at a cost that conveniently excluded the masses. As if the aquatic adventures weren't enough, the sanatorium also offered electrotherapy. Yes, electricity. The great harnessed power of the industrial age was thought to hold the key to healing. Patients were hooked up to devices that delivered controlled shocks, purportedly to stimulate nerves and muscles. This was the dawn of a new age, when electricity was seen as a miracle cure, despite a glaring lack of evidence. These machines, with their wires and cranks, looked more like torture devices from a mad scientist's lab. But in the 19th century, they were cutting-edge technology. The idea was that mild electrical currents could re-energize tired bodies and jolt sluggish organs into action. It was the ultimate in Victorian techno-optimism, where science and spectacle went hand in hand. The pseudoscience behind these treatments was thick as the smog that blanketed London. Yet, the allure of modernity, combined with the desperation of the ill, created a perfect storm of demand. People wanted to believe in these cures because the alternative, a life of suffering with no remedy, was too grim to bear. What's fascinating is how these practices, bizarre as they seem now, were rooted in the era's broader medical understanding, or lack thereof. Medicine was in a transitional phase, teetering between ancient humoral theories and the nascent field of bacteriology. In the absence of antibiotics or effective vaccines, doctors clung to any theory that seemed plausible, however loosely. The Victorian obsession with water and electricity reflected broader societal trends. The Industrial Revolution had transformed the world, bringing new technologies and unprecedented urban growth. With change came anxiety, and with anxiety came the search for new ways to manage the resulting stress and disease. Sanatoriums offered a retreat from this frenetic pace, selling the dream of a return to health through natural and scientific means. The economic context was equally intriguing. These institutions were not just centers of healing, but also profit-driven enterprises. Their proprietors understood the power of marketing, presenting themselves as bastions of cutting-edge medicine. They promised transformations that were as much about social status as they were about health, tapping into the Victorian fascination with progress and self-improvement. The real kicker, despite the questionable efficacy of these treatments, patients often reported feeling better after their stays. This isn't surprising when you consider the placebo effect and the simple fact of being removed from polluted, overcrowded cities. A few weeks of rest, a change of scenery, and the absence of daily stresses could work wonders, even if the methods themselves were more show than substance. By the time the afternoon rolls around, you're starting to get the hang of the routine, even if your body is still in shock from the morning's events. The sanatorium experience is an endurance test, a strange blend of hope, hype, and hardship. It's a testament to the lengths we'll go to for the promise of health, even when the path is paved with dubious practices. As you prepare for the next round of treatments, you're left with a sense of awe at the human capacity for belief. The sanatoriums of the Victorian era may have been steeped in pseudoscience, but they were also a reflection of a society grappling with its own rapid transformation. They were places of contradiction, where the cutting edge collided with the archaic, and where the quest for wellness sometimes masked a more profound search for meaning in a changing world. Stay tuned, because the Victorian Sanatorium still has more tricks up its starched sleeves, and we'll dive deeper into this peculiar world in the next installment. Speaking of starched sleeves, it's time to roll them up, because lunch at a Victorian sanatorium is not for the faint of heart or the delicate of palate. Welcome to the culinary crime scene, where what's on your plate is a lesson in class, science, and a dash of 19th century insanity. Let's dish out the reality. Victorians were in a love affair with gruel, a dish that sounds like it could double as an insult. But this wasn't just any gruel. It was the kind that made Oliver Twists look like a feast. The star ingredient, oats or barley, boiled until any hint of flavor or texture had been thoroughly obliterated. This was served with the enthusiasm of a funeral procession and the nutritional value of a damp sponge. But don't be too quick to judge. This wasn't just food, it was a status symbol. In the Victorian Sanatorium, your midday meal was a reflection of your social standing as much as your health. The upper echelons of society could expect their gruel refined, perhaps even accompanied by a slice of dry bread or the occasional piece of boiled chicken. You see, the sanatoriums catered to the affluent, and even in this austere setting, class distinctions persisted. The wealthier patients were sometimes treated to luxuries like milk or eggs, an extravagance that left the less fortunate with their sad, solitary bowls of gloop. It's crucial to understand that this dietary regimen was not just about depriving you of pleasure. It was rooted in the early stirrings of nutritional science. The Victorian era was a time of burgeoning curiosity about the human body, its needs, and, unfortunately, its limitations. Experts of the day were convinced that simple, bland foods would purify both body and soul, stripping away the excesses of modern life. In their minds, culinary austerity was the recipe for health. This wasn't just a fad, it was a veritable movement. Pioneers like Sylvester Graham, of Graham cracker fame, preached the gospel of plain eating as a path to righteousness. He believed that spicy or rich foods inflamed the passions, never mind that he had no scientific basis for such claims. Meanwhile, John Kellogg, yes, that Kellogg, was running his own version of a sanatorium, where he pushed a vegetarian diet and invented cornflakes as a cure for indigestion and lust, presumably in that order. The sanatorium's dietary restrictions mirrored broader societal anxieties. The Industrial Revolution had transformed diets, introducing processed foods and sugar on an unprecedented scale. Suddenly, what you ate was not just a personal choice, but a public concern. The upper classes, always keen to distinguish themselves, embraced the notion that simple diets were not just virtuous, but essential to maintaining social order. Let's sprinkle in a little economic context. By the late 1800, the average annual wage for a worker in Britain was about £40. Meanwhile, a week's stay at a sanatorium could cost up to £30, And that's before you even factor in the added costs of any extra treatments or the slightly more edible meal options. For many, this was an unattainable luxury, making these institutions exclusive playgrounds for the well-to-do. This economic divide was reflected in the very food served, where one's place at the table was as much about one's wallet as one's waistline. The irony, of course, is that the sanatoriums were selling deprivation as luxury. In a world where the poor struggled to fill their stomachs, the wealthy paid handsomely to have theirs half full and wholly virtuous. The allure was powerful. By enduring the rigors of a sanatorium diet, the affluent could signal both their moral and social superiority. It was a curious case of suffering as status, where the less you consumed, the more you were worth. The initial appeal of the sanatorium's dietary regimen lay in its promise of purification and moral uplift. Yet, beneath this veneer of virtue lurked the economic realities that truly powered these institutions. They marketed themselves as bastions of health, but operated as businesses, capitalizing on the era's anxieties and the wealthy's willingness to pay for peace of mind, or at least peace of stomach. As you pick at your lunch, you might ponder the curious Victorian obsession with self-denial. It's a theme that echoes throughout their approach to health and wellness. The belief was that by stripping away the excesses of life, one could achieve a purer, more authentic existence. In practice, it often meant living in a perpetual state of discomfort, whether through cold baths, electrifying treatments, or flavorless meals. But let's not mince words. The science behind these diets was more guesswork than gospel. The understanding of nutrition was still in its infancy, and while some concepts were beginning to take shape, others were wildly off the mark. Vitamins wouldn't be discovered until the 20th century, and calories were a concept as foreign as a smartphone. Yet, the conviction with which these diets were enforced was unshakable, a testament to the power of belief over knowledge. In the context of a Victorian sanatorium, this belief translated into a peculiar culinary landscape, where the simplicity of your meal was both a virtue and a necessity. It was a world where the right to blandness was a privilege, and where every spoonful of gruel was a reminder of your place in the social order. Despite its dubious nutritional value, the sanatorium lunch played a crucial role in the broader narrative of health reform. It exemplified the era's struggle to reconcile modern life with ancient ideas of wellness. It was a time when the past and present clashed, and the resulting friction gave rise to a host of curious beliefs and practices. As you spoon the last of your sad, grey lunch into your mouth, it's clear that the Victorian sanatorium was more than just a place of healing. It was a microcosm of its time. It reflected the hopes, fears, and contradictions of a society caught between the past and the future, grappling with the rapidly changing world around it. And while the methods might seem quaint or even absurd today, they were part of a broader quest for meaning and order in an increasingly chaotic world. As lunchtime fades into memory and the afternoon routine looms, you're left to reflect on the curious interplay of science, class, and health that defined the Victorian sanatorium. It's a testament to the human capacity for both belief and endurance, and a reminder that sometimes the search for wellness is as much about the journey as the destination. Stay tuned, because this culinary adventure is far from over. There's more to uncover about the Victorian obsession with health, and we'll be diving deeper into the peculiar world of the sanatorium as we continue our exploration. So, buckle up, or in this case, button up those starched sleeves, because the story is just heating up. As the afternoon sun ambles lazily through the sanatorium's grimy windows, you find yourself transitioning from the culinary delights of gruel to an activity the Victorians deemed equally nourishing: enforced rest. Welcome to the realm of the rest cure, where doing absolutely nothing was hailed as the zenith of medical achievement. Before you settle in for this mandated idleness, let's talk about why the Victorians were so enamored with rest cures. Spoiler alert, it wasn't just about relaxation. The idea that rest could heal was rooted in the belief that overstimulation from modern life was frying people's nerves faster than you could say industrialization. In a world obsessed with progress, this was the era's equivalent of hitting pause on your mental cassette player. These rest cures were particularly popular among women who were considered more susceptible to the dangers of modernity, because apparently ovaries made one fragile. The cure involved lying in bed for weeks, sometimes even months, with minimal mental stimulation. We're talking about a pillow-strewn prison where you weren't even allowed to read. After all, God forbid you exercised your brain while your body was busy doing nothing. This concept was championed by the likes of Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell, the 19th century physician who prescribed this peculiar remedy to many, including the writer Charlotte Perkins Gilman. She famously chronicled her experience in The Yellow Wallpaper, a short story that paints a vivid picture of descending into madness under the guise of healing. If you're sensing a touch of irony here, you're not alone. While the rest cure was predominantly prescribed to women, men weren't entirely exempt. However, their version of rest often involved retreating to a mountain lodge or hitting the open road, because why should men suffer in silence when they could go fishing instead? This gendered approach was a reflection of broader societal norms that saw women as delicate creatures needing protection from the rigors of modern life, while men were, presumably, tough enough to handle a bit of fresh air and solitude. The economic context of these cures is another layer of intrigue. A rest cure could cost a small fortune, accessible only to those who weren't counting pennies. For the wealthy, it was a status symbol. For the middle class, it was a stretch. And for the poor, it was as attainable as a unicorn. The cure's exclusivity mirrored the societal divide, where one's ability to rest was directly correlated with one's social standing. But enough lounging around, because the sanatorium's afternoon delight isn't just about lying still. It's time for the moral lecture, a staple of Victorian wellness that makes your average TED talk look like a stand-up comedy gig. Here, the resident expert, usually a doctor with an impressive beard and an even more impressive sense of self-importance, would enlighten you on the virtues of virtuous living. Imagine a sermon on the perils of vice, delivered with the fervor of a preacher at a tent revival. These lectures were designed to cleanse the soul as much as the body, promoting a lifestyle that was as devoid of joy as it was of germs. The message was clear. Morality was your best defense against disease, and straying from the path of righteousness was a one-way ticket to the sanatorium. These moral lectures were steeped in the social anxieties of the time. The Industrial Revolution had brought about unprecedented social change, and with it, a fear that the moral fabric of society was unraveling faster than a cheap Victorian corset. The lectures served as a bulwark against this perceived decline, reinforcing the idea that personal health was inextricably linked to moral rectitude. The content of these lectures varied, but they often touched on themes of temperance, moderation, and self-control. They were peppered with warnings against the dangers of excess, be it in the form of alcohol, rich foods, or even passionate emotions. In an age where self-denial was seen as a virtue, these lectures were a reminder that indulgence was not just a personal failing, but a societal threat. The economic implications of these moral lectures are worth noting. For many sanatoriums, the lectures were a branding tool, a way to market themselves as institutions of not just physical healing, but also moral uplift. This was a savvy move, appealing to the Victorian obsession with self-improvement while also justifying the high cost of a stay. After all, who wouldn't pay for the chance to emerge not just healthier, but also holier? As you sit through the lecture, fighting the urge to nod off, you can't help but marvel at the Victorian capacity for contradiction. They embraced progress while simultaneously fearing its consequences, turning to the past for solutions to problems created by the present. The sanatorium, with its mix of modern science and moralizing tradition, was a microcosm of an era grappling with its own identity. The afternoon drags on, and you're left to ponder the curious interplay of rest and morality, health and virtue, that defined the Victorian sanatorium. It's a world where doing nothing was an art, and listening to moral lectures was an exercise in patience. It's also a world that reflects the broader societal trends of its time, where the quest for wellness was as much about status as it was about health. In the end, the Victorian sanatorium was less about curing illness and more about reinforcing the social order. It was a place where the wealthy could indulge in the luxury of deprivation, where women were treated like porcelain dolls, and where morality was as much a part of the treatment as cold baths and gruel. It was a reflection of a society in flux, caught between the past and the future, struggling to find its place in a rapidly changing world. As the afternoon fades into evening, the sanatorium's routine continues, a relentless march of rituals designed to heal the body while soothing the soul. But beneath the surface, it's clear that the true cure lies not in the treatments themselves, but in the stories they tell about the society that created them. Stay tuned for more, because the Victorian Sanatorium still has secrets to spill, and we're just getting started in unraveling its peculiar charms. As the sun sets, and the day winds down in this peculiar realm of the Victorian Sanatorium, you're left to ponder the economic and social tapestry woven by these bygone institutions. It's a fabric rich in complexity, stitched with threads of hope, desperation, and a touch of Victorian madness. Sanatoriums weren't just health havens. They were a booming industry, capitalizing on the era's anxieties while promising salvation at a premium price. You see, these institutions were the health resorts of their day, a burgeoning sector in a world where the concept of wellness was as much about class as it was about cure. By the late 19th century, sanatoriums had become a veritable cottage industry, a testament to the era's entrepreneurial spirit. They were often nestled in picturesque locales. Think Swiss mountains and English countryside, where the air was crisp, the scenery was serene, and the promise of healing was worth its weight in gold. But let's not romanticize too quickly. These retreats charged a pretty penny. For perspective, a week-long stay at a sanatorium could drain your pockets of anywhere from £10 to £30. This was at a time when the average yearly wage for a British worker was a mere £40. So, unless you had a money tree in your backyard, your stay was likely short-lived. These institutions were less about universal healthcare and more about catering to the elite, where the true illness was often affluence itself. Economically, sanatoriums were a reflection of a society quick to monetize modernity's maladies. They were part of a broader health industry that was beginning to recognize the profit potential in treating, not curing, chronic conditions. The model was simple: offer an escape from the chaos of urban life, sprinkle in some pseudo-scientific treatments, and wrap it all in the allure of exclusivity. Voila! You had a successful business venture on your hands. Politically and socially, sanatoriums played into the Victorian obsession with self-improvement and moral rectitude. They offered a narrative of health that was closely tied to personal virtue, where discipline and deprivation were seen as pathways to purity. In a way, these institutions were the spiritual ancestors of today's wellness industry, which still capitalizes on the insecurities and aspirations of its clientele. Whether it's a Victorian cold plunge or a modern juice cleanse, the underlying message remains: health is a commodity, and it doesn't come cheap. As the day in the sanatorium draws to a close, it's worth reflecting on the broader impact of these establishments. They were, in many ways, a product of their time, a time when the industrial world was trying to reconcile its rapid advancements with the age-old quest for health and happiness. Yet, they also serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of placing too much faith in unproven remedies and the seductive power of health fads. The decline of the sanatorium was as much about advances in medicine as it was about changing social attitudes. By the early 20th century, the advent of antibiotics and improved public health measures rendered many of these institutions obsolete. What was once a booming industry began to wither in the face of real scientific progress. The sanatorium, with its cold baths and moral lectures, couldn't compete with the efficacy of a simple antibiotic shot. Yet, the legacy of the Victorian Sanatorium lingers in today's wellness culture. The modern health retreat, with its yoga classes and detox diets, is a direct descendant of those 19th century health resorts. The promises of transformation and renewal, the allure of exclusivity, and the blending of health with lifestyle. These are all echoes of a time when health was both a personal journey and a public spectacle. In the end, the story of the Victorian Sanatorium is one of human folly and resilience. It's a reminder that the search for wellness is as much about the stories we tell ourselves as it is about the treatments we undergo. It's a tale of belief triumphing over evidence, of society grappling with its own contradictions, and of the perpetual dance between progress and nostalgia. As you drift off to sleep, the lessons of the sanatorium day linger in your mind, an odd mix of fascination and disbelief. It's a slice of history that offers both humor and humility, a testament to the enduring human quest for health in all its bizarre and brilliant forms. So, next time you book that wellness retreat or reach for the latest health trend, remember the Victorian Sanatorium and its curious blend of charm and charlatanry. It might just make you appreciate the modern world and its miracles a little bit more. In the rural village of Mvizo, South Africa, the year was 1918, and the world was on the tail end of World War I. While most were still reeling from the global chaos, a young lady named Nankafai Noskini was busy with a different kind of noise, the cries of her newborn son, Ralehlala, which in Xhosa means pulling the branch of a tree, or, for a modern twist, Troublemaker. Now, whether you believe in nominative determinism or not, little Ralehlala seemed destined to live up to his name. Growing up in the Transkei, Ralehlala Mandela was surrounded by the rugged beauty of the region, a place where rolling hills met the sky and cattle were more than just livestock, they were social currency. His father, Gadla Henry Mfakaniuswa, was a local chief and councillor to the monarch, which might sound prestigious, but let's not get carried away. This was colonial South Africa, after all, where being a black chief was like being the king of a very small, very oppressed kingdom. Still, it was a position that came with its own brand of respect and influence, something that would later rub off on young Mandela. Walking barefoot to school, as many children did, Ralehlala wasn't just learning his ABCs. He was absorbing the complexities of a society divided by more than just geography. Colonial policies were the rule of the day, and the color of your skin dictated not just your opportunities, but your very identity. At the age of 7, Ralehlala was shipped off to a Methodist school, where he was renamed Nelson by a teacher who probably thought African names were just too much hassle. Ah, colonialism, the gift that just keeps on giving. Nelson Mandela's early education was a mix of traditional African values and the Western-style schooling imposed by colonial rulers. It was a confusing cocktail of learning about the great British Empire while knowing that your own people were considered less than second-class citizens. But little Mandela was a quick study, and he took to his lessons with vigor, perhaps fueled by the implicit understanding that knowledge was a key to power. Fast forward to 1939, and Mandela found himself at the University of Fort Hare, the only residential university for black people in South Africa at the time. With about 150 students, Fort Hare was a hub of intellectual ferment and political debate. Here, the seeds of Mandela's activism were sown, and he was introduced to a world of ideas that challenged the status quo. However, the university experience wasn't all about books and lectures. Mandela was elected to the Student Representative Council, and what could have been a straightforward role quickly turned into a political minefield. You see, the students at Fort Hare were none too pleased with the administration's control over their social lives, and Mandela, ever the troublemaker, was caught up in a boycott against university policies. The administration, not keen on students who actually used their voices, decided to flex their academic muscles. Mandela was offered an ultimatum: either drop the boycott or get the boot. True to form, Mandela chose to stand his ground, and by the end of his first year he faced expulsion. Now, getting expelled might sound like a disaster, but for Mandela it was more like a plot twist. Forced to leave Fort Hare, he made his way to Johannesburg, a city that was as bustling as it was segregated. Imagine a place where gold rush dreams clashed with apartheid realities. Johannesburg was the economic engine of South Africa, but for black South Africans, it was a city of limits. Jobs were scarce, housing was worse, and the past laws were a constant reminder of a system determined to keep people in their designated places. In Joburg, Mandela found work as a night watchman at Crown Mines, a gig that was about as glamorous as it sounds. But more importantly, it was here that he met Walter Sisulu, a real estate agent and political activist who would become a lifelong friend and mentor. Sisulu saw something in Mandela, a spark, a potential for leadership that was too promising to ignore. He encouraged Mandela to study law, a suggestion that would eventually change the course of South African history. Mandela enrolled at the University of Witwatersrand, where he pursued a law degree. It was a challenging environment, not just because of the academic rigor, but also due to the rampant racism. Mandela was one of the few black students and often faced hostility from both peers and professors. But adversity has a funny way of sharpening resolve, and Mandela's experiences only deepened his commitment to fighting injustice. As he navigated the complexities of life in apartheid South Africa, Mandela's political consciousness continued to evolve. He joined the African National Congress in 1944, a move that marked the beginning of his formal political career. The ANC was undergoing a transformation of its own, with younger members like Mandela pushing for more radical action against the oppressive regime. It was a time of great change, and Mandela was at the heart of it, driven by a passion for justice that would soon become legendary. But let's not get too far ahead. In these early years, Mandela was just starting to find his voice, learning to balance the scales of idealism and pragmatism. It was a balancing act that would define much of his later work. As the young Troublemaker from Mvizo found his footing in the tumultuous world of South African politics, the stage was set for a journey that would take him from the dusty roads of Transkei to the halls of power in Pretoria. But for now, Mandela was still climbing, still learning, and still very much human, a man on the cusp of greatness, with the whole world yet to watch. As Mandela found his footing in the tumultuous world of South African politics, the stage was set for a journey that would take him from the dusty roads of Transkei to the chaotic vibrancy of Johannesburg's activist scene. It was 1944, and while the rest of the world was embroiled in the final throes of World War II, Mandela was part of a different kind of battle, a battle against the entrenched injustices in his own backyard. Into the African National Congress Youth League, or ANC Youth League, for the acronym aficionados among us. Formed as an offshoot of the African National Congress, the Youth League was the brainchild of Mandela and his like-minded cohorts, including Oliver Tambo and Walter Sisulu. These guys were like the Avengers of anti-apartheid, only instead of superpowers, they had determination, eloquence, and a penchant for political strategy. Why a youth league, you ask? Well, the ANC at the time was seen as a bit too, let's say, seasoned. It had the energy of a tired uncle at a family reunion, well-meaning, but lacking that youthful spark. The Youth League was about injecting some much-needed vigor and urgency into the fight against apartheid. And boy, did they have ideas. They wanted to move beyond the polite petitions and passive resistance that had characterized much of the ANC's earlier efforts. The Youth League was about direct action, baby, and they weren't afraid to stir things up. Now, let's not romanticize this too much. Starting a youth league in 1944 South Africa wasn't exactly like starting a book club. It took guts, and a fair amount of chaos ensued. Resources were scarce, surveillance was constant, and the stakes were higher than a giraffe on stilts. Yet Mandela and his crew persevered, organizing rallies, protests, and meetings with the kind of fervor that only youthful idealism can fuel. But idealism, as we all know, has a knack for getting a harsh reality check. Fast forward to 1952, and we find ourselves at the heart of the Defiance Campaign, a nationwide protest against apartheid laws. Picture this: 500 volunteers, or defiers, took to the streets to openly flout apartheid laws, risking arrest to make a point. Mandela was one of the key organizers, and it was a logistical nightmare that would make even the most seasoned event planner break out in a cold sweat. Coordinating protests across a country where the government was eager to squash dissent was no small task. The campaign was designed to be non-violent, and while it didn't bring down the apartheid regime, it did succeed in shaking things up and drawing international attention to South Africa's plight. The government, predictably, wasn't thrilled. They responded with the Suppression of Communism Act, because when in doubt, just call everyone a communist and hope for the best, right? Mandela and his fellow activists were arrested, but the campaign had already lit a fire that wouldn't be easily extinguished. It was during these years that Mandela's reputation as a leader of moral courage and strategic brilliance really began to crystallize. But let's pause for a moment and get real. While the Defiance Campaign was a bold move, it wasn't a magic bullet. The apartheid regime wasn't about to crumble overnight. Yet this was a pivotal moment that galvanized the anti-apartheid movement, setting the stage for future actions. It was proof that the system could be challenged, that ordinary people could take a stand, and that Mandela and his comrades were forces to be reckoned with. And speaking of reckoning, let's talk about the infamous treason trial of 1956, a legal circus that would have made P.T. Barnum blush. Picture this: 156 activists, including Mandela, arrested and charged with treason, a crime that could have ended with the death penalty. The trial dragged on for a whopping 5 years, from 1956 to 1961, becoming a masterclass in judicial procrastination. It was like the legal equivalent of watching paint dry, but with much higher stakes. The trial was a smorgasbord of absurdities. The charges were so broad and poorly defined that they could have applied to a particularly rebellious pet cat. Yet, despite the Kafkaesque proceedings, Mandela and his co-accused remained resolute. They used the trial as a platform to expose the injustices of apartheid to the world, turning what was meant to be a show trial into a stage for resistance. Finally, in 1961, after enough legal drama to fill several seasons of a courtroom TV show, the charges were dropped, and Mandela and his comrades were acquitted. It was a significant victory, but also a reminder of the lengths to which the apartheid regime would go to stifle dissent. The trial had taken 5 years of Mandela's life, but instead of breaking him, it only seemed to sharpen his resolve. Now, let's not sugarcoat things. The acquittal was more of a tactical retreat by the government than a genuine victory for justice. But it was a moment that underscored Mandela's reputation as a leader who could withstand immense pressure without losing sight of his principles. It showed the world that the anti-apartheid movement wasn't just a flash in the pan, but a sustained struggle with leaders ready to endure whatever came their way. As the 1960s dawned, Mandela was more than just a political activist. He was becoming a symbol of the broader fight against oppression. But let's not get too carried away with the myth-making just yet. Mandela was still very much human, navigating a landscape fraught with danger and uncertainty. He was a man on a mission, but one who knew that the road ahead was long, winding, and perilous. So there you have it, the formation of the ANC Youth League, the chaotic brilliance of the Defiance campaign, and the farcical yet consequential treason trial. Each chapter added a new layer to Mandela's growing legend and set the stage for the next phase of his incredible journey. But don't go thinking this is the end of the story. We're just getting started, and trust me, there's a lot more history to unravel. As we press pause on the courtroom drama and step into the 1960s, it's time to trade in the suits and ties for something a bit more, shall we say, militant. Mandela, ever the maestro of reinvention, was about to embark on a new chapter that would have him swapping legal briefs for guerrilla tactics. Enter Umkhonto, Wisizwe, or Spear of the Nation, for those whose ex-hosts are a bit rusty. Founded in 1961, this was the armed wing of the ANC, a group forged in the fires of frustration and desperation, a response to the government's persistent deafness to peaceful protest. Now, forming a military organization in apartheid South Africa was a bit like trying to start a barbecue in a hurricane. It was risky, ambitious, and highly likely to end in disaster. But Mandela and company were running out of options. The government had made it clear they weren't interested in dialogue, and the international community was about as effective as a chocolate teapot. So Mandela, along with Joe Slovo, a communist lawyer with a penchant for revolution, and other key figures, decided it was time to take the fight underground. And let's be clear, this wasn't about random acts of violence. The aim was to sabotage infrastructure, not to harm civilians, an important distinction in the morally murky waters of conflict. The first act of sabotage went off on December 16, 1961, a date chosen with strategic brilliance. It was the Day of the Covenant, a public holiday commemorating a 19th century battle that had become a symbol of Afrikaner nationalism. Talk about making a statement. But even as Umkhonto Wisizwe began to gain momentum, the noose was tightening around Mandela. He became a man on the run, living a double life as a chauffeur while eluding the police at every turn. Think of him as the original master of disguise, long before Hollywood got hold of the trope. But Mandela's luck was about to run out. In August 1962, after 17 months on the lam, he was arrested near Howick in KwaZulu-Natal. The police roadblock that snagged him was no coincidence. The CIA, ever eager to play global hall monitor, had tipped off the South African authorities. Mandela was charged with inciting workers to strike and leaving the country without a passport, which sounds like a glorified traffic ticket until you realize the potential penalty was life imprisonment. The trial was a foregone conclusion, and Mandela was sentenced to 5 years behind bars. Now, you think that would be the end of it, right? But the plot, like a good detective novel, thickens. While Mandela was cooling his heels in prison, the government raided Lillisley Farm, a safe house in Rivonia where senior ANC leaders were hiding out. The evidence they found was enough to make any prosecutor salivate: documents, maps, and plans for guerrilla operations. It was like stumbling upon the ultimate anti-apartheid playbook. Naturally, Mandela was implicated, even though he was already behind bars, because why waste a perfectly good scapegoat? This brings us to the Rivonia trial, a legal spectacle that would have made even the most reality TV-obsessed viewer sit up and take notice. Held from 1963 to 1964, it was a who's who of the anti-apartheid movement. Mandela and 10 others faced charges of sabotage, and the stakes were as high as they'd ever been. The death penalty was on the table, and the apartheid regime wasn't exactly known for its leniency. But here comes the twist, the moment that would etch Mandela's name into the annals of history. In a bold move, Mandela chose to make a statement from the dark, a speech that was less defense and more declaration of principles. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities, he proclaimed. It was a mic drop moment, one that ended with the chilling. It is an ideal for which I am prepared to die. Boom. In those few minutes, Mandela redefined the narrative, turning what could have been a story of defeat into one of moral victory. The world held its breath as the verdict loomed. On June 12, 1964, Mandela and 7 others were sentenced to life imprisonment. No death penalty, but the message was clear. These men would be locked away, far from the revolution they had sparked. Mandela's new home was Robben Island, a desolate outcrop off the coast of Cape Town that was less luxury resort and more Alcatraz with a tan. For the next 18 years, this would be his world, a place where time crawled and the outside world was but a distant memory. Life on Robben Island was tough, to put it mildly. Prisoners were assigned menial labor, and Mandela found himself wielding a pickaxe in a limestone quarry. If you ever wondered how he maintained his physique, there you go. But this wasn't just about physical endurance. The conditions were designed to break spirits, with isolation and hard labor as the tools of the trade. Yet Mandela, ever the strategist, turned the prison into a university of sorts, a place where debates flourished and minds were sharpened. It was a testament to his resilience, a refusal to let the system dictate who he was or what he could become. Let's not romanticize prison life, though. It was brutal, unyielding, and often soul-crushing. The guards weren't exactly handing out hugs, and communication with the outside world was sporadic at best. But Mandela's resolve remained unbroken, a beacon of hope in a world intent on extinguishing it. In those years on Robben Island, he became more than a man. He became a symbol, a living testament to the power of the human spirit against insurmountable odds. So there you have it, the formation of Umkhonto we Sizwe, the cat-and-mouse game of Mandela's arrest, the high-stakes courtroom drama of the Rivonia trial, and the harsh realities of life on Robben Island. Each chapter adds depth to the legend, peeling back layers to reveal the man behind the myth. But don't go thinking this is the end of the story. The journey's far from over, and as Mandela serves his time, the world outside is changing in ways that will one day make his release inevitable. So stay tuned, because the best is yet to come. And so, while Mandela chipped away at rocks under the unforgiving sun of Robben Island, the world outside began to chip away at apartheid's icy grip. It's the 1980s, and South Africa's political scene is harder than a jalapeno in a heat wave. International pressure was building faster than a toddler's tantrum, and the global community was finally catching on that apartheid wasn't just a local quirk. It was a full-blown human rights catastrophe. Cue the Free Nelson Mandela campaign, a movement that spread like wildfire through every corner of the globe. From the bustling streets of London to the jazz-infused neighborhoods of Harlem, Mandela's name became a rallying cry for justice. Let's talk numbers, shall we? By the 1980s, South Africa was facing economic sanctions from over 23 countries. Trade restrictions were tightening around its neck like a particularly unfashionable tie. The country's GDP took a nosedive, and inflation rates were climbing as if they were training for the Olympics. The message from the international community was clear: change your ways or face economic oblivion. But the government, like a stubborn old mule, refused to budge. They had their heels dug in, and no amount of international scolding was going to make them move. Meanwhile, back on Robben Island, Mandela was becoming more than just a symbol. He was practically a legend in living form. Yet let's not paint this as some kind of fairy tale. Life in prison was grim, and Mandela's health was deteriorating. The limestone quarry wasn't just hard on the muscles, it was brutal on the eyes, causing permanent damage to Mandela's vision. But even in the depths of despair, Mandela's spirit was unyielding. He managed to negotiate better conditions, not just for himself, but for all political prisoners. It's said that when life gives you lemons, you make lemonade, but Mandela turned those metaphorical lemons into a full-blown citrus empire. By the mid-1980s, Mandela's name was on everyone's lips, but his voice had been silent for decades. Enter Zinzi Mandela, his daughter, who delivered a speech on his behalf at a public rally in 1985. The speech made jaws drop faster than a clumsy waiter at a five-star restaurant. It was a resounding rejection of an offer from the government to release Mandela, provided he denounced violence. Mandela's response was clear. What freedom am I being offered while the organization of the people remains banned? Boom. Another mic drop moment from the man who was technically still on mute. Now, let's debunk a myth or two. It's easy to romanticize Mandela's prison years as a time of quiet reflection, as if he were some kind of political monk meditating his way to enlightenment. In reality, his time behind bars was a chess game of political maneuvering. By the late 1980s, secret negotiations were underway between Mandela and the apartheid government. These weren't casual chats over coffee. They were high-stakes discussions that would shape the future of South Africa. Mandela met with government officials at Palsmore Prison, where he had been transferred in 1982, and later at Victor Verster Prison. These meetings were a delicate dance, requiring Mandela to balance firmness with diplomacy, wisdom with wit. And then came February 11, 1990, a date etched into history with the kind of drama that would make a soap opera jealous. After 27 years behind bars, Mandela walked free, his stride as steady as ever. The world watched with bated breath as he emerged from the gates of Victor Verster Prison, hand in hand with his then-wife, Winnie Mandela. But let's not gloss over the tension that preceded this moment. It was a release that came with strings attached, a careful negotiation that had been years in the making. Mandela's release was less of a quiet liberation and more of a media frenzy reminiscent of the Beatles' first U.S. tour. Cameras clicked faster than a teenager's thumbs on a smartphone, and reporters scrambled to capture every word, every gesture. The sheer scale of the media circus was staggering. It was as if the entire world had converged on this one man, ready to record history in real time. But beneath the euphoria and the celebrations, there was an undercurrent of uncertainty. What did Mandela's release mean for South Africa? Would it lead to peace or plunge the nation into chaos? The truth is, Mandela's release was a turning point, but it was far from a panacea. South Africa was still a country rife with tension, its society a volcano on the brink of eruption. The economic sanctions, the international pressure, the relentless activism, all these factors had set the stage for Mandela's freedom, but they hadn't solved the deep-rooted issues at play. Mandela himself knew that his work was just beginning. The real challenge lay ahead, transforming a fractured nation into one of unity and equality. And so, as Mandela took his first steps into freedom, the world watched with hope, trepidation, and a dash of skepticism. The journey from prisoner to president was still unfolding, and it was a path fraught with obstacles. But if anyone was up to the task, it was Nelson Mandela, a man whose life had already defied the odds, and who was now poised to redefine the very fabric of South African society. Stay tuned, because this story is far from over, and as history has shown, Mandela's legacy is one that continues to inspire, challenge, and endure. And so, Mandela stepped onto the global stage, not as a mere historical footnote, but as a living testament to resilience and reconciliation. It was the dawn of the 1990s, and South Africa was in the throes of an identity crisis that could make a teenager's existential angst look like a walk in the park. Mandela's release was a political game-changer, but the real challenge was still on the horizon, the first democratic elections in South Africa's history. These elections were slated for April 1994, a date that would either be etched into the annals of peace or explode into chaos. And yet, as the calendar inched toward this historic moment, the nation was a pressure cooker of racial tension, economic disparity, and political uncertainty. To call Mandela's task Herculean would be an understatement. He had to transform a country that had been more divided than a pizza at a teenage sleepover. The economy was teetering on the edge, with GDP growth limping along at about 2% per year, and unemployment rates as high as 20–30%, depending on who you asked. It was as if someone had handed him a puzzle with missing pieces, and the only instructions read, "Good luck." But if Mandela was anything, he was a master of the impossible. His approach to reconciliation was like a magician pulling rabbits out of a hat, unexpected, yet mesmerizing. He understood that building a new South Africa meant more than just dismantling apartheid. It meant fostering a spirit of forgiveness in a nation still scarred by its past. Enter the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a platform designed to air grievances and seek justice without the bloodshed. It was a novel concept, one that recognized the power of storytelling over retribution. And while it was far from perfect, it was a start, a step toward healing that the world watched with both skepticism and hope. April 27, 1994, finally arrived, and with it, a tidal wave of voters, an estimated 7 million cast their ballots. The lines at polling stations were longer than a CVS receipt, stretching for miles, as people waited patiently to exercise a right that had been denied to them for so long. When the dust settled, the African National Congress emerged victorious, and Mandela was inaugurated as South Africa's first black president. The swearing-in ceremony was a spectacle that could rival any royal wedding, complete with dignitaries from over 140 countries, and enough pomp to make even the British monarchy blush. As president, Mandela faced a laundry list of challenges that would make even the most seasoned leader break out in a cold sweat. The economy was still in shambles, with inflation rates hovering around 10%, and there was the small matter of uniting a nation that had been divided for centuries. But Mandela approached these issues with the same dogged determination that had carried him through 27 years of imprisonment. He championed the Reconstruction and Development Program, an ambitious plan to provide housing, healthcare, and education to millions of South Africans. It was a noble goal, but the execution was about as smooth as a gravel road. Yet, for all its flaws, it laid the groundwork for future progress, setting in motion the slow, often painful process of nation building. Of course, Mandela's presidency wasn't all work and no play. He had a knack for disarming even the most hardened critics with his humor and wit. When asked about his retirement plans, Mandela quipped that he was looking forward to watching the grass grow and listening to the birds sing. It was this light-heartedness that endeared him to many, a reminder that even in the weightiest of times, a little levity could go a long way. Now, let's address the elephant in the room, the myth of Mandela as the infallible saint. It's tempting to canonize him, to paint his life in broad strokes of heroism and virtue. But to do so would be to erase the complexity of his legacy. Mandela was a man, not a myth, flawed, human, and sometimes contradictory. He acknowledged the limits of his power and the imperfections of his presidency, once saying, "I am not a saint, unless you think of a saint as a sinner who keeps on trying." This brings us to the crux of Mandela's legacy, the enduring impact of his life's work. It's easy to get caught up in the fairy tale, to see Mandela as a singular savior who single-handedly changed the course of history. But the truth is far more nuanced. Mandela was a catalyst, a spark that ignited a movement that was much larger than any one person. His legacy is one of collective action, of people coming together against all odds to demand change. As we reflect on Mandela's journey from prisoner to president, it's clear that his story is not just about one man, but about the power of resilience, forgiveness, and humanity. It's a reminder that history is not just a series of dates and events, but a tapestry woven from the lives and struggles of those who dare to defy the status quo. In the end, perhaps Mandela's greatest gift was his ability to inspire, a legacy that continues to resonate long after his time. And so, as we close the chapter on Mandela's remarkable life, we're left with a sense of both admiration and introspection. His story is a testament to the power of the human spirit, a call to action for all of us to strive for a better world. Nelson Mandela may have left the stage, but his legacy endures, a beacon of hope, and a challenge to us all to keep pushing for justice, equality, and understanding. And that, dear listeners, is a legacy worth celebrating. In the hustle and bustle of ancient Rome, young Julius Caesar was the kind of guy who would have worn sunglasses indoors if they existed back then. Born on July 12, 100 BCE, into the patrician Julii family, Caesar was practically handed a VIP ticket to Rome's social and political arenas. His family claimed descent from Aeolus, son of the Trojan hero Aeneas, who was supposedly the son of Venus herself. Talk about setting the bar high for family reunions. But noble blood didn't mean life was easy. Rome was less of a city and more of a political marsh pit, where alliances were as stable as a soap bubble. Caesar's father, Gaius Julius Caesar, died suddenly in 85 BCE, leaving the teenage Julius as the head of the family. Now, if you've ever been a teenager, you know that managing even a goldfish can be a challenge, let alone a family with a legacy. Fast forward to his early 20s, and Caesar is already making waves, but not the ones that get you invited to toga parties. His uncle by marriage, Gaius Marius, was a prominent general and 7-time consul, which sounds impressive until you realize he was embroiled in a bitter power struggle with Lucius Cornelius Sulla. When Sulla marched on Rome in 82 BCE, Caesar, who had married Cornelia, the daughter of one of Marius's allies, found himself on the wrong side of history. Sulla ordered him to divorce Cornelia, but Caesar refused. It's like the ultimate Romeo and Juliet, with political daggers instead of familial ones. Sulla, not exactly a fan of romantic defiance, put Caesar on a proscription list, meaning he was basically a freebie for any bounty hunter looking for a quick buck. Caesar wisely decided that discretion was the better part of valor and skipped town, hiding out in the Sabine country, which was probably like fleeing to your uncle's cabin in the woods when the city gets too hot. Eventually, Sulla relented, reportedly saying, "In this young man there is many a Marius." With the political climate a bit less murder-why, Caesar returned to Rome and started climbing the political ladder, but not without a detour that would make any action movie envious. In 75 BCE, while sailing to Rhodes to study oratory under Apollonius Malar, Caesar was captured by Cilician pirates. These weren't your average peg-legged, rum-guzzling pirates. Oh no, they were the sophisticated kind, demanding a ransom of 20 talents of silver. Caesar, with the kind of confidence only a future dictator could muster, laughed in their faces and suggested they ask for 50. While his associates scurried to gather the ransom, Caesar made himself at home among the pirates, joining their games and even shushing them when he needed to sleep, treated them more like hosts than captors, and when he promised to crucify them after his release, they chuckled, thinking it a joke. Big mistake. Once freed, Caesar raised a fleet, hunted down the pirates, and true to his word, had them crucified. This little escapade wasn't just a flex. It was a masterclass in persuasive negotiation and ruthless follow-through. Back in Rome, Caesar's career began to pick up steam. In 68 BCE, he was elected quaestor, a role that was essentially the ancient equivalent of an accountant with a sword. The following years saw him climb the political hierarchy, leveraging his connections and charm to secure positions like aedile and Pontifex Maximus. The latter title, chief priest of the Roman state religion, wasn't just a clerical post. It was a power move, giving him influence over religious and political life. Plus, it came with a swanky house in the Forum, which was the ancient Roman equivalent of scoring a penthouse on Park Avenue. Caesar knew how to play the crowd like a maestro. He organized lavish games and gladiatorial contests, not just for fun, but to win the hearts of the Roman populace. His splashy spectacles were rumored to cost a fortune, but they paid dividends in popularity. It was a classic case of bread and circuses, except the bread was sometimes metaphorical, and the circuses were literally life and death. As Caesar's star rose, so did his debts. He wasn't exactly a budget-conscious kind of guy, and his political maneuvers were bankrolled by loans from Rome's wealthiest. But in the cutthroat world of Roman politics, Caesar's debts were like his favorite toga, always present, but never a hindrance. His ascent continued with the formation of the first triumvirate in 60 BCE, political alliance that would make any reality TV producer salivate. Joining forces with Pompey the Great, Rome's superstar general, and Crassus, the richest man in Rome, Caesar created a power trio that bypassed traditional republican governance. They were the original power brokers, trading favors and manipulating the Senate like a trio of seasoned poker players at a high-stakes table. This alliance wasn't just a casual pact. It was a strategic masterstroke. Pompey brought military clout, Crassus brought financial backing, and Caesar brought the charisma and political acumen. Together, they bulldozed through Senate opposition and secured key provinces and military commands. The Roman Senate, a body that made modern politics look tame, was outraged but largely impotent against the triumvirate's combined might. In 59 BCE, Caesar became consul, the highest office in the Roman Republic, and he used his new power to push through laws that benefited his allies and himself. As consul, he showed a knack for political theater, once bringing his colleague, Bibulus, to a public assembly and having a bucket of filth dumped over him. It wasn't just politics, it was a statement, a reminder that Caesar was not to be trifled with. Despite the chaos, Caesar's ambitions were a finely tuned orchestra. He wanted more than just the temporary power of a consul. He wanted lasting influence, and for that, he needed military successes. His sights were set on Gaul, a vast region that was part wilderness, part warrior culture, and entirely ripe for conquest. But that's a tale for another day, as the young Caesar's ascent to glory was just getting started, with the Roman world waiting to see what this audacious, often reckless, yet undeniably brilliant leader would do next. With Caesar's eyes set on Gaul, the stage was set for one of history's most audacious military conquests. Gaul, for those of you not up on your ancient geography, was roughly the size of modern-day France, Belgium, and parts of Switzerland, Luxembourg, and Germany. Picture a land of tribal warriors, sprawling forests, and as far as Rome was concerned, opportunity wrapped in barbarian chaos. The Gallic Wars, which kicked off in 58 BCE, would become Caesar's grand theater of war, a stage where he could flex his strategic muscles and, let's face it, his ego. Now, let's not sugarcoat it. Caesar's endeavor in Gaul wasn't just about expanding Rome's borders. Sure, there was glory to be gained and Roman civilization to spread, but Caesar had debts to pay and a reputation to cement. War in Gaul was his ticket to both. The man was a walking paradox, ambitious, charismatic, and at times ruthless, a bit like a rock star who also happened to be a military genius, though that title might require some myth-busting. Caesar's campaign began with the Helvetii, a Gallic tribe with a hankering for migration. These folks were basically the ancient equivalent of a road-tripping clan, planning to move en masse from modern Switzerland to the western coast of Gaul. We're talking about 368,000 people, according to Caesar's own commentaries. Though historians suspect he might have inflated the numbers to make his victory sound more epic. Who wouldn't write? In any case, Caesar wasn't about to let these wandering Gauls traipse through Roman territory, so he met them with the full force of his legions. The Battle of Bibracte was a key showdown, and Caesar wasn't one to shy away from a fight. With about 50,000 Roman soldiers at his command, he outmaneuvered and overwhelmed the Helvetii. The numbers were staggering. Over 200,000 Helvetii were reportedly killed or captured. This wasn't just a military victory. It was a message to all of Gaul that Caesar meant business. The Roman Senate back home was simultaneously impressed and uneasy, realizing that Caesar was becoming a bit too powerful for comfort. Speaking of power, let's talk about the Roman legions. These weren't just soldiers. They were the finest killing machine of their time. The legions were highly trained, disciplined, and loyal, not just to Rome, but to Caesar himself. Each legion comprised about 800 men, though Caesar often operated with a few legions in reserve, ready to pounce at a moment's notice. And they marched. Oh, how they marched. These guys could cover up to 20 miles a day, fully geared, and still have the energy for a skirmish at the end of it. Makes you wonder what kind of energy drinks they had back then. Caesar's next opponent was the fearsome chieftain, Vercingetorix. His name might sound like a villain from a Saturday morning cartoon, but Vercingetorix was no joke. As the leader of the Arvni tribe, he united the Gauls in a revolt against Roman rule. Picture a charismatic leader rallying diverse tribes with nothing more than a battle cry and a promise of freedom. In 52 BCE, Vercingetorix ambushed Caesar at Gergovia, delivering a rare but significant defeat to the Romans. For Caesar, it was a wake-up call, a reminder that his ambition might be met with resistance more formidable than he anticipated. But Caesar was nothing if not relentless. The showdown at Alesia in 52 BCE was Caesar's piece de resistance. Vercingetorix had holed up in the fortified hill town, hoping to outlast the Roman siege. Caesar, in a move that was part genius, part madness, decided to build not one but two walls. The inner wall, or circumvallation, kept the Gauls in, while an outer wall, or contravallation, kept reinforcements out. Picture a massive donut of doom made of earth, timber, and Roman resolve. The siege lasted a brutal month, with both sides suffering from hunger and exhaustion. But Caesar's double wall strategy paid off. When the Gauls tried to break through, Caesar's men held firm. The numbers tell the tale. Around 80,000 Gallic warriors were defeated, and Vercingetorix himself was captured, later paraded through Rome like a trophy before his execution. It was a decisive victory, one that cemented Caesar's reputation as a military strategist of the highest order. But let's not get too carried away with the legend. While Caesar was undeniably brilliant, his success in Gaul wasn't just a product of genius. It was also about timing, resources, and a fair bit of luck. The Roman machine was already a formidable force, and Caesar's knack for propaganda can't be underestimated. His Commentarii de Bello Gallico, a first-hand account of the Gallic Wars, was as much a piece of self-promotion as it was a historical record. Caesar knew how to spin a tale, portraying himself as the hero of his own epic saga. The political ramifications of the Gallic Wars were seismic. Back in Rome, Caesar's enemies watched his rising star with growing alarm. His victories brought wealth and prestige, but they also fueled fears of his ambition. The Senate was caught in a bind. They needed Caesar's military successes, but they dreaded his growing power. It was a classic case of damned if you do, damned if you don't. Caesar's conquests expanded Rome's territory, but they also set the stage for a showdown that would ultimately reshape the Republic. As the dust settled in Gaul, Caesar found himself at the height of his power, but also on the brink of a new conflict. His relentless drive had brought him glory, but it also sowed the seeds of discord that would soon erupt into civil war. The Gallic Wars weren't just about the battles. They were about ambition, propaganda, and the precarious balance of power. And with Caesar, the story was far from over. The Roman world had yet to see the full extent of his ambition, and the consequences would be nothing short of revolutionary. But that's a story for another day, as the saga of Julius Caesar continues to unfold, with twists and turns that would make any modern drama seem tame. With Caesar at the pinnacle of his power, the Roman world stood on the precipice of chaos, like a soap opera teetering on the edge of a season finale cliffhanger. Fresh off his triumphs in Gaul, Caesar wasn't just basking in the glow of his conquests. He was eyeing the political landscape back in Rome. But the Senate, wary of his growing influence, was starting to see him less as a hero and more as the guy who shows up uninvited and eats all the hors d'oeuvres. As they say, absolute power corrupts absolutely, or at least makes you unpopular at dinner parties. The real kicker came when the Senate, led by Caesar's old buddy-turned-rival Pompey, ordered him to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. Think of it as a kind of ancient Roman pink slip, except with way more potential for bloodshed. Caesar, never one to back down from a challenge, saw this move for what it was: a calculated attempt to strip him of power and potentially set him up for prosecution. It was a classic political trap, and Caesar had no intention of walking into it like the proverbial lamb to the slaughter. Enter the Rubicon, a small river in northern Italy that would become the setting for one of history's most famous gambles. In 49 BCE, Caesar stood on its banks, staring down a decision that would forever alter his fate, and that of the Republic. Crossing the Rubicon meant declaring war on Rome itself, a move so audacious it made his earlier exploits look like child's play. With his legion at the ready, Caesar famously declared, "Alia iacta, est," the die is cast. It was the ancient equivalent of going all in at the poker table, with the stakes being nothing less than the future of Rome. As Caesar's legions marched south, the Roman political landscape experienced a seismic shift. Pompey and many senators fled to Greece, not exactly ready to face Caesar's military machine head-on. Their departure left Rome in a state of chaotic vacancy, a bit like a house party, where the hosts have suddenly decided to ditch. Caesar, ever the opportunist, didn't waste time in seizing the moment. With a deftness that would make any modern political strategist green with envy, he secured Rome without a fight, positioning himself as both a conqueror and a savior, at least in his own mind. But let's not be too quick to buy into the Caesar as savior narrative. While he portrayed himself as restoring order to a Rome plagued by corruption and inefficiency, his actions were far from altruistic. This was a power play of the highest order, a strategic maneuver that put him in the driver's seat of Roman politics. And let's face it, despite the charm and charisma, Caesar was as self-serving as they come. His ambitions weren't just about reforming Rome, they were also about reshaping it in his image. As the civil war erupted, it became clear that Caesar was playing a high-stakes game of chess against some of Rome's most formidable figures. The battlefield became his new arena, with skirmishes and sieges across the Mediterranean world. In 48 BCE, the showdown at Pharsalus in Greece marked a critical turning point. Outnumbered by Pompey's forces, Caesar's legions displayed remarkable discipline and tactical brilliance, delivering a crushing defeat to his old ally turned adversary. Pompey, once the darling of Rome, fled to Egypt, where he met a rather unceremonious end, murdered on the orders of Pharaoh Ptolemy Roman 13. Talk about a plot twist that would make even Shakespeare blush. Caesar's victory at Pharsalus wasn't just a military triumph. It was a signal to the world that he was a force to be reckoned with, a leader who could bend fate to his will. Yet, even in victory, Caesar's challenges were far from over. His pursuit of Pompey had inadvertently dragged him into the complex politics of Egypt, a land as rich in opportunity as it was in intrigue. Here, he encountered Cleopatra, the enigmatic queen whose own ambitions were as towering as the pyramids themselves. Cleopatra wasn't just another royal figure. She was a savvy political operator in her own right. With her brother and co-ruler Ptolemy Roman 13 vying for power, Cleopatra saw in Caesar both a potential ally and a powerful protector. Their alliance, both personal and political, would cement her position in Egypt and further Caesar's influence across the Mediterranean. But let's not romanticize the encounter too much. This wasn't a fairy tale of star-crossed lovers, but a calculated partnership with mutual benefits. Cleopatra needed Caesar's military clout, and Caesar, well, he wasn't exactly one to shy away from expanding his sphere of influence. Back in Rome, the Senate was in a bind, struggling to maintain its authority in the face of Caesar's growing power. The traditional republican structures were buckling under the weight of his ambition, and the once sacrosanct notion of shared governance was being overshadowed by the shadow of a single man. Caesar was reshaping the political landscape, and with each victory he edged closer to a form of autocracy that made the Senate increasingly nervous. Despite his triumphs, Caesar was acutely aware that his position was precarious. The Roman Republic was a political beast with many heads, and cutting one off often resulted in two more taking its place. His reforms, though sweeping, were met with resistance from those who saw them as threats to their power. Caesar's attempts to centralize authority and streamline governance were in many ways pragmatic responses to a system that had grown inefficient and corrupt. Yet, the irony of his actions wasn't lost on those who saw him as the embodiment of the very tyranny they feared. As Caesar navigated this treacherous political terrain, he faced the eternal question of whether the ends justified the means. His efforts to stabilize Rome and consolidate power raised fundamental issues about the nature of leadership and governance. Was Caesar a visionary reformer, or merely another ambitious leader who cloaked his personal ambitions in the guise of public service? The jury, as they say, was still out, and history would continue to debate his legacy long after the dust had settled. In the end, Caesar's transition from military leader to political heavyweight wasn't just about the battles he fought or the territories he conquered. It was about redefining what it meant to wield power in Rome, challenging the status quo, and confronting the uncomfortable truths about governance and ambition. While his story was far from over, the die had indeed been cast, setting in motion events that would ripple through history like a stone tossed into a pond. As the saga of Julius Caesar continued to unfold, the Roman world was left to grapple with the consequences of his audacious gamble, a game of thrones that would reshape the Republic and echo through the ages. As Julius Caesar tightened his grip on power, Rome was in for a wild ride, akin to strapping oneself to a chariot with no reins. His dictatorship wasn't just another chapter in Rome's history. It was more like a season finale with enough cliffhangers to keep generations talking. Sure, he wore the title of dictator, but Caesar was determined to redefine what that word meant. Traditionally, Roman dictators were temporary leaders, appointed during emergencies and expected to relinquish power once the crisis was over. But Caesar, ever the innovator, seemed to think of himself as a permanent fixture, like that awkward family heirloom that no one knows how to get rid of. Let's dive into some of the nitty-gritty of Caesar's reforms. Perhaps his most enduring legacy, one that you probably use every day without even realizing, is the Julian calendar. Before Caesar's intervention, the Roman calendar was a hot mess, an unpredictable jumble that made scheduling anything a nightmare. Picture trying to plan a meeting when the year could randomly gain or lose days, like some cosmic practical joke. The lunar-based system was about 355 days long, and to keep it in sync with the solar year, officials would periodically add a month. As you can imagine, this system was ripe for political manipulation. Enter Caesar, who, with the help of the Alexandrian astronomer Sarsigenes, devised a solar calendar with a fixed 365-day year and an extra day every 4 years. Voila, the leap year. Introduced in 46 BCE, the Julian calendar was a game-changer, providing the kind of stability that even Caesar couldn't always promise. But calendars weren't the only area where Caesar left his mark. His economic reforms were just as significant, though perhaps not as romanticized. Rome's social fabric was fraying, with a growing divide between the rich, who lived in opulent villas, and the poor, who struggled to get by in cramped insulae, essentially ancient Roman apartment blocks, minus the elevators, and with a higher chance of catching fire. Caesar attempted to address these inequalities by redistributing public lands to veterans and the poor, a move that was as much about securing loyalty as it was about social justice. Yet, while it sounded noble, these actions often disrupted local economies and stepped on the toes of wealthy landowners who weren't exactly thrilled about losing their estates. Caesar's debt reforms were equally contentious. He recognized that Rome was practically swimming in IOUs, with debts soaring like a chariot race gone haywire. His solution, a partial debt cancellation that reduced the amount owed by a significant chunk, around a quarter. This move pleased debtors, but left creditors fuming, as it was essentially a financial sleight of hand that shifted the economic scales. It was a classic case of robbing Peter to pay Paul, or in this case, appeasing the masses at the expense of the wealthy elite. Politically, Caesar's reforms often walked the fine line between genius and tyranny. He expanded the Senate from about 600 to 900 members, which on the surface seemed democratic, but in reality, he packed it with his supporters. It was like stacking the deck in your favor, while everyone else was still trying to figure out the rules. This expansion diluted the power of old patrician families, making the Senate more of a rubber stamp for his policies. Caesar was reshaping Rome's political landscape, but the Senate wasn't entirely out of the picture, more like a puppet show with Caesar pulling the strings. Caesar's reforms extended to the provinces too, where he granted more rights to non-Romans, a move that was both pragmatic and strategic. By extending Roman citizenship to loyal cities and individuals, he was building a broader base of support that transcended the traditional boundaries of the Roman state. It was a clever way to secure loyalty from newly conquered territories, but it also raised eyebrows among traditionalists who feared the dilution of Roman identity. In many ways, Caesar was like a master chess player, thinking several moves ahead while everyone else was still setting up their pieces. Now, let's not gloss over the darker side of Caesar's rule. While he presented himself as a reformer, his methods were often heavy-handed. The myth of the benevolent dictator is tempting, with its narratives of a leader who puts the people first. But the reality was more complex. Caesar's concentration of power was unprecedented, and his willingness to bypass traditional republican processes set a dangerous precedent. His rule was characterized by a centralization of authority that left many Romans uneasy, as it seemed to undermine the very foundations of the Republic. Yet, despite, or perhaps because of, his authoritarian tendencies, Caesar remained immensely popular with the Roman populace. His public works projects, such as the Forum Iulium, provided jobs and boosted his image as a man of the people. It was political theater at its finest, with Caesar cast as the star in a drama where his audience was both adoring and wary. He understood the power of public opinion and wielded it like a sword, cutting through opposition with charm and populism. In the end, Caesar's reforms were a mixed bag, part visionary and part self-serving. They addressed some of Rome's most pressing issues, but did so in a way that concentrated power in his hands. His actions left a legacy that was as much about the changes he implemented as the political tensions he exacerbated. The Roman Republic, with its checks and balances, was being overshadowed by the looming figure of Caesar, a man whose ambition seemed boundless. As Rome grappled with these shifts, the stage was set for further upheaval, with Caesar's legacy hanging in the balance like a sword of Damocles over the future of Roman governance. So, as we pause here, remember that Caesar's story is far from over. The myth, the man, and the reality are intertwined in a complex tapestry that continues to captivate us. But the tale of Julius Caesar still has more twists to offer, with the Roman world poised on the brink of transformation. Stay tuned for more, as the saga of one of history's most enigmatic figures continues to unfold, shaping the course of an empire and echoing through the corridors of time. As the saga of Julius Caesar continues, let's dive into the climax of this historical roller coaster, the Ides of March, 44 BCE. Picture Rome as a boiling cauldron of ambition, paranoia, and political intrigue, with Caesar as the master chef stirring the pot. Despite his reforms and popularity, he'd ruffled more than a few feathers among Rome's elite. They saw him not as a savior, but as a threat, one who was monopolizing power like a kid hoarding Halloween candy. Now, let's talk about the conspirators, those senators who decided Caesar's time was up. There were around 60 of them, a who's who of Roman politics, including the likes of Gaius Cassius Longinus and Marcus Junius Brutus. Brutus, in particular, adds a Shakespearean twist to the tale. He was a man caught between loyalty and legacy, as his ancestor was one of Rome's founding fathers who helped oust the last king. Talk about a family tradition of political upheaval. On March 15th, 44 BCE, Caesar made his way to the theater of Pompey, where the Senate was meeting. It was business as usual, or so it seemed. As Caesar entered, he was surrounded by senators wielding daggers, not scrolls. The attack was brutal and swift, with Caesar reportedly stabbed 23 times. The scene was chaotic, a grim illustration of what happens when politics turns personal and history becomes a crime scene. Even more chilling, according to Suetonius, Caesar's last words were "Et tu, Brute," or, as we might say today, "You too, buddy." Whether or not this line is historical or poetic license, it captures the betrayal's sting. In the aftermath, Rome was a city in turmoil. Caesar's assassination was meant to restore the Republic, but instead it threw the city into chaos, like a fireworks show gone wrong. The conspirators had hoped for a hero's welcome, but instead they got a public outcry. It turns out, people weren't too keen on the old Republic's dysfunction, and Caesar, for all his flaws, had been a stabilizing force. The power vacuum left by his death was like a black hole, sucking Rome into civil war. Enter Mark Antony and Octavian, Caesar's allies who weren't about to let his death go unanswered. Antony, Caesar's right-hand man, delivered a funeral oration that was part eulogy, part rallying cry, stirring the crowd into a frenzy. Meanwhile, Octavian, Caesar's 18-year-old grandnephew and adopted heir, showed up with ambition sharper than a gladiator's sword. Together, they sought to avenge Caesar's death and secure their own positions of power. The ensuing power struggle was a classic showdown, with the second triumvirate of Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus forming to crush the conspirators. They weren't playing around. They prescribed enemies, confiscated property, and generally made life miserable for anyone who crossed them. It's a reminder that politics, then as now, was often a brutal business. This civil war culminated in the Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE, where the forces of Antony and Octavian clashed with those of Brutus and Cassius. The result, a decisive victory for the triumvirs and a grim end for the conspirators, who took their own lives rather than face capture. The Republic's defenders were no more, and Rome's fate was sealed. Its transformation from republic to empire was underway, with Octavian at the helm. By 27 BCE, Octavian had become Augustus, the first Roman emperor, marking the end of the Republic and the birth of the empire. Augustus was a master of spin, portraying himself as the restorer of Rome's greatness while consolidating power like a true autocrat. Caesar's death had unwittingly paved the way for this new era, a twist of fate that would have seemed almost poetic if it weren't so tragic for the Republic's ideals. Now, let's talk legacy, because Caesar's is a mixed bag of myth, reality, and everything in between. On the one hand, he's remembered as a military genius, a reformer, and a man who reshaped Rome. His conquests expanded the empire, and his reforms laid the groundwork for the centralized power of the emperors. His calendar reform alone is a testament to his impact, with the Julian calendar serving as a basis for the one we use today. Not bad for a guy who started off dodging Sulla's hit list. But on the flip side, Caesar's role in the Republic's downfall can't be ignored. His concentration of power and disregard for traditional checks and balances set a precedent that Augustus would exploit. The romanticized image of Caesar as a benevolent dictator often overshadows the reality of his ambition and the consequences it wrought. As for the myth-making, Caesar himself was a master of it, penning commentaries that glorified his exploits. Over time, his story has been shaped and reshaped, with each generation casting him as hero, villain, or something in between. His life and death have inspired countless works of art, literature, and of course, a certain play by Shakespeare. It's a reminder of how history's great figures often become larger than life, their legacies as much about perception as reality. In the end, Julius Caesar remains an enigma, a figure who defies easy categorization. He was a product of his time, yet a man ahead of it, with a legacy that echoes through history like the footsteps of his legions. His life was a testament to the power of ambition, both its potential and its peril. As we wrap up this chapter, remember that the story of Rome and Caesar's place in it is a tale of power, politics, and the human condition, with all its triumphs and tragedies. The empire he helped forge would endure for centuries, a testament to his enduring impact, for better or worse. And as we reflect on his legacy, perhaps the greatest lesson of all is the timeless dance between ambition and consequence, a narrative as old as history itself. The story of Clemens von Metternich begins in a world teetering on the edge of upheaval, where Whigs were big, and revolutions even bigger. Born on May 15, 1773, in a small town called Koblenz, nestled in the Holy Roman Empire, Metternich entered the world just as Europe was about to undergo some serious remodeling. His childhood, like a prelude to a Mozart opera, was steeped in noble privilege, thanks to his father, Franz Georg Karl von Metternich, a diplomat of the empire. Diplomacy, it seemed, was as much in his blood as was a knack for being in the right place at the right time. Growing up in a noble household was a bit like living in a historical drama with a touch of absurd comedy. Metternich's early years were filled with lessons in Latin, fencing, and the art of not falling asleep during endless aristocratic banquets, a skill that would serve him well in later life. His family rubbed elbows with the political elite, and dinner-table conversations were less about mundane matters like the weather and more about the complex chessboard of European politics. It's not hard to imagine young Clemens, wide-eyed and perhaps slightly bored, absorbing these discussions like a sponge. When it came time for higher education, Metternich packed his bags and headed to the University of Strasbourg. Now, Strasbourg wasn't just any university. It was a hotbed of Enlightenment ideals, a place where ideas about liberty, equality, and fraternity were as fashionable as powdered wigs. And here's where the plot gets a little twisty. While Metternich was busy studying law and diplomacy, the French Revolution was simmering next door, ready to boil over. Imagine being a student in the late 1780, casually attending lectures on the social contract, only to witness France decide it no longer liked contracts at all, especially those involving the monarchy. The revolution officially kicked off in 1789, and while heads were rolling in Paris, Metternich was taking notes. He quickly learned one of life's cruel truths. Revolutions are like soufflés, exciting in concept, but they tend to collapse under pressure. Strasbourg was a melting pot of revolutionary fervor, but Metternich's noble upbringing and keen sense of self-preservation nudged him to view these events through a lens of skepticism. He had a front-row seat to the chaos, and while the Enlightenment was all about exploring new ideas, Metternich was thinking about how to keep his head, both figuratively and literally. By the time Metternich returned to his native land, He had developed a firm belief in maintaining order, perhaps inspired by the Enlightenment's darker lessons on what happens when society decides to toss the rulebook out the window. It's safe to say he wasn't the type to join a mob, unless, of course, that mob was headed to a diplomatic gala. Metternich's education wasn't just about dodging revolutionary guillotines or mastering Latin declensions. It was where he honed his talent for diplomacy. He learned that politics was less about grand gestures and more about subtle nudges. Essentially, he was perfecting the art of saying, "Let's talk about this," when everyone else was reaching for pitchforks. It was a skill that would come in handy as Europe continued to play its favorite game, who wants to redraw the map. The young diplomat-to-be also had a habit of collecting acquaintances like some people collect stamps. One of his noble connections was with Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, the literary giant who, among other things, wrote Faust and was the 18th century equivalent of a rock star. Hanging out with Goethe was like networking on steroids, and it helped Metternich understand the power of influence and persuasion, tools that would prove invaluable in his future career. However, it wasn't all serious study and networking. Metternich was known for his flair, a penchant for parties, and a personality that could charm the sarks off even the most stoic aristocrat. He was the kind of guy who could walk into a room of rival diplomats, make a witty remark, and leave everyone wondering if they were friends or foes. This charisma, combined with his noble status, made him a natural at the diplomatic game. As Metternich graduated from university and stepped into the world of politics, the backdrop of the French Revolution served as an ongoing reminder of the stakes involved. He wasn't just learning about diplomacy, he was witnessing firsthand what happens when diplomacy fails. The guillotine was a persuasive argument for keeping one's wits about them, and Metternich was nothing if not a man who valued his neck. In the years that followed, Metternich would carry these lessons with him as he navigated the turbulent waters of European politics. He understood that power was a delicate balance, a game of cat and mouse where the stakes were as high as the powdered wigs were tall. His noble roots gave him a seat at the table, but it was his education and sharp wit that ensured he stayed there. So there you have it, the early life of Clemens von Metternich, a man destined to become one of Europe's greatest diplomats. His story, like all good tales, is part comedy, part drama, and entirely fascinating, with a foundation built on noble privilege, an education steeped in revolutionary fervor, and a personality that could outcharm a room full of peacocks. Metternich was ready to take on the world. Little did he know, the world would soon be knocking on his door, demanding answers, and maybe a few political maneuvers along the way. Metternich's world was about to get a whole lot more chaotic, as if someone had just tossed a live grenade into the genteel drawing room of European diplomacy. The 1790s rolled in, and with it came the Napoleonic Wars, a series of conflicts that set Europe ablaze and left nations scrambling to pick up the pieces. Enter Clemens von Metternich, a man who would soon find himself in the thick of it, not by accident, but by a series of calculated moves that would make a chess grandmaster nod in approval. In 1809, Metternich landed the role of Austria's foreign minister, a title that sounds prestigious, but was actually more akin to being the captain of a ship in a storm, with cannonballs flying and the crew on the verge of mutiny. Austria, under the Habsburgs, was trying to navigate these turbulent waters, while Napoleon Bonaparte was out there, playing risk on expert mode. Napoleon had a knack for winning battles, over 60 by some counts, and making enemies, which worked out well for Metternich, who was more interested in forging alliances than making war. Metternich's strategy was simple yet brilliant. Play it cool and keep Austria relevant. He understood that in a world obsessed with power, the real game was influence. Sure, Napoleon was conquering territories faster than a kid collecting Parkhamen cards, but Metternich was more interested in the long game, where the prize was stability in Europe, not just a temporary victory. Now, let's talk about the Congress of Vienna, 1814-1815, Metternich's piece de résistance. This was the diplomatic equivalent of a reality TV reunion special, where all the major players gathered to hash out their differences. Picture a room full of egos the size of empires, each with their own agenda, and Metternich in the middle, juggling these ambitions like a seasoned circus performer. The Congress was about redrawing the map of Europe after Napoleon's defeat, and Metternich was determined to ensure Austria didn't lose its influence in the process. Metternich's approach was a masterclass in diplomacy. He knew that Europe's stability hinged on balance, not domination, and he was prepared to bend over backward, or at least lean strategically to make it happen. He turned charm into an art form, using his wit and charisma to sway opinions. To Metternich, diplomacy was like a dance, and he made sure he was always leading. The Congress wasn't a simple affair. It lasted nearly a year, with representatives from over 200 states, principalities, and territories. Think of it as a marathon of negotiation, where the stakes were as high as the towering feathered hats of the delegates. Metternich worked tirelessly to forge a consensus, often smoothing over disputes with the grace of a ballroom dancer. He was the peacemaker, but also the puppet master, pulling strings behind the scenes to keep Austria at the center of European politics. One of the myths surrounding the Congress is that it was all about parties and indulgence. Sure, there were balls and banquets aplenty, but beneath the surface was a relentless grind of negotiation and compromise. Metternich understood that the social events were not just frivolous distractions, but crucial opportunities to build alliances. After all, who could resist a proposal after a glass, or three, of fine Austrian wine? But let's not sugarcoat it. The Congress wasn't all roses and waltzes. The reality was a complex web of power plays and backroom deals, with Metternich leveraging every ounce of his diplomatic savvy. He dealt with leaders like Tsar Alexander I of Russia, who fancied himself a divine ruler, and King Frederick William Roman III of Prussia, who had a penchant for military might. Metternich had to balance these clashing egos while keeping an eye on Britain's foreign secretary, Viscount Castlereagh, who had his own ideas about Europe's future. Metternich's triumph at Vienna was securing the status quo, a Europe that would not be dominated by any one power, especially not France, which was now under the rule of the restored Bourbon monarchy. He crafted a framework that would keep peace in Europe for nearly a century, a feat that seems almost miraculous given the continent's penchant for conflict. It was as if Metternich had managed to tame a room full of lions using nothing but a firm handshake and a well-timed jest. Despite the success, Metternich's legacy is a mixed bag. Some see him as a conservative force, a defender of the old order who resisted the tides of change sweeping across Europe. Others view him as a pragmatist who recognized the limits of power and worked to maintain a delicate balance. Love him or loathe him, there's no denying his impact on the European stage. The Congress of Vienna marked the height of Metternich's influence, but it was just the beginning of his story. His balancing act at Vienna was not just a triumph of diplomacy, it was a testament to his understanding of the political realities of his time. He knew that peace was not simply the absence of war, but a fragile equilibrium that required constant attention. As the Congress wrapped up and the delegates returned to their respective countries, Metternich remained vigilant. He understood that while the immediate threat of Napoleon was over, the challenges of maintaining peace were just beginning. Europe was a continent in flux, with new ideas and movements bubbling beneath the surface, ready to challenge the status quo at any moment. Metternich's story is far from over. The treaties signed at Vienna were just the foundation, and the real test would be how well they held up in the years to come. As he returned to his role as Austria's foreign minister, Metternich knew that the game of diplomacy was never truly over. It was a constant dance, a never-ending waltz where the stakes were as high as the ambitions of the players involved. And Metternich, ever the master tactician, was ready to keep dancing. With the ink barely dry on the treaties of Vienna, Metternich was already setting the stage for his next act, a grand diplomatic balancing act that would make Cirque du Soleil look like amateur hour. You see, for Metternich, peace was never just about treaties. It was about maintaining a delicate equilibrium among Europe's notoriously fickle powers. Enter the Metternich system, a name that sounds like a revolutionary diet plan, but was actually a web of alliances and espionage designed to keep Europe from imploding. Now, here's where the myth-making begins. Metternich is often painted as Europe's puppet master, pulling strings with the deftness of a marionette artist. In reality, his system was less a master plan and more a patchwork quilt sewn together with a mix of diplomacy, flattery, and a dash of good old-fashioned paranoia. He wasn't so much orchestrating a symphony as he was conducting a cacophony of competing interests. The backbone of Metternich's strategy was the Holy Alliance, a league formed in 1815 by Russia, Austria, and Prussia. On paper, it sounded noble, Christian monarchs banding together to preserve peace. In practice, it was about as harmonious as a cat and dog duet. Metternich, ever the pragmatist, saw it as a tool to curb liberal uprisings and keep the revolutionary spirit in check. Tsar Alexander, I might have dreamed of a divine mission, but for Metternich, it was more about keeping a lid on Europe's boiling pot of unrest. Speaking of unrest, let's talk about espionage. If you think spy games are a modern invention, think again. Metternich's Europe was a hotbed of cloak and dagger antics, complete with intercepted letters, double agents, and enough paranoia to fuel a James Bond marathon. The Austrian secret police, under Metternich's watchful eye, were tasked with sniffing out dissenters and revolutionaries hiding under every rock. They were the 19th century equivalent of a neighborhood watch, if the neighborhood was the entire continent. But let's not kid ourselves. Metternich's spy network was more Inspector Clouseau than MI6. There were countless botched plots and laughably bad intel. Imagine a scene where intercepted letters reveal more about Count Ludwig's latest romantic escapades than any political intrigue. In one famous incident, a letter detailing a supposed plot against Austria turned out to be a grocery list. Yet, even amid such farce, Metternich managed to use what scraps of intelligence he gathered to keep the Austrian Empire at the center of European politics. All this espionage wasn't cheap, mind you. The Austrian treasury was shelling out hefty sums to maintain this network of spies, informants, and secret police. We're talking about tens of thousands of florins annually, a small fortune in those days, especially when you consider the cost of a loaf of bread was just a few cruisers. But Metternich deemed it a necessary investment. After all, peace doesn't come free, and neither does a functioning surveillance state. One of the more notorious episodes in Metternich's spy chronicles involved the Carbonari, secret society with a penchant for revolution, and a name that sounds suspiciously like an Italian pasta dish. These guys were serious about change, and equally serious about keeping their plans under wraps. But Metternich, ever the meddler, was determined to infiltrate their ranks. The resulting escapades would have made for a great comedy if they weren't so deadly serious. Despite the Keystone Cops' nature of much of this espionage, Metternich's system was not without its successes. He managed to quash several potential uprisings and kept revolutionary fervor from spreading like wildfire. His secret police were adept at nipping conspiracies in the bud, even if they occasionally mistook innocent correspondence for coded messages. Yet, for all Metternich's efforts, the forces of nationalism and liberalism were gathering like storm clouds on the horizon, ready to rain on his parade of peace. While Metternich was busy playing Europe's peacekeeper, was also trying to hold together the patchwork quilt of the Austrian Empire itself. The empire was a veritable mosaic of ethnicities and nationalities, each with its own desires and grievances. Balancing these conflicting interests was akin to juggling flaming torches while riding a unicycle across a tightrope. No easy feat, even for a man of Metternich's diplomatic prowess. The Metternich system, with its alliances and espionage, may have seemed like a grand strategy, but it was as much a product of its time as it was a reflection of Metternich's own personality. It was a system built on relationships, both personal and political, and its success hinged on Metternich's ability to play the role of the charming yet calculating diplomat. He wielded his influence like a maestro, conducting the symphony of European politics with a mix of grace and guile. His charisma was a tool as valuable as any treaty, enabling him to navigate the treacherous waters of international relations with aplomb. Yet, beneath the surface of this diplomatic dance lay the harsh realities of 19th century statecraft. The world was changing, and Metternich was fighting a losing battle against the tide of history. Nationalism was on the rise, and the old order he sought to preserve was increasingly under siege. The revolutions Metternich so feared were fermenting in the hearts and minds of people across Europe, eager for change and ready to challenge the status quo. And so, the story of Metternich's system is not just one of espionage and intrigue, but also one of inevitable transformation. It's a tale of a man trying to hold back the floodwaters of change with little more than a diplomatic umbrella. The Metternich system may have held for a time, but it was ultimately a stopgap measure in a world hurtling toward modernity. As the whispers of revolution grew louder, Metternich's grip on power began to wane. The system he crafted, with all its brilliant intricacies and glaring flaws, was a reflection of its creator, a man who was equal parts visionary and reactionary, a diplomat who understood the art of compromise, but also the necessity of control. It was a system that worked, until it didn't, a testament to the challenges of maintaining peace in a world that seemed, at times, determined to unravel. Yet, even as the cracks began to show, Metternich remained a stalwart figure on the European stage, his influence undiminished by the passage of time. His legacy is a complex one, marked by both successes and failures, triumphs and missteps. He was a man of his era, a diplomat who navigated the turbulent waters of 19th century politics with skill and style. But for all his achievements, the world was changing, and Metternich would soon find himself swept up in the tide of history. As we leave Metternich in the midst of his intricate web, the stage is set for the next chapter in his story, a tale of revolutions, reforms, and the relentless march of progress. The Metternich system may have been a temporary fix, but the forces it sought to contain were far from vanquished. Europe was on the brink of a new era, and Metternich, ever the diplomat, would have to adapt or be left behind. The dance of diplomacy continued, and Metternich was still very much in the game, his eyes set firmly on the challenges that lay ahead. As the dance of diplomacy continued, Metternich found himself increasingly out of step with the rhythm of a rapidly changing Europe. The revolutions that had once been mere whispers on the breeze were now the thunderous drums of 1848, echoing across the continent. It was a year that would become synonymous with upheaval, a political Woodstock minus the peace and love, where the old guard was about to get a serious wake-up call. Metternich, the maestro of the status quo, had spent decades fine-tuning his orchestra of alliances, but the revolutionary fervor of 1848 was an entirely different tune, one he couldn't quite seem to master. The irony. The man who once kept Europe's peace with a deft touch was now being swept aside by the very forces he tried to suppress. It was as if the universe had decided to play a particularly cruel joke on the diplomat who thought he had all the answers. At the heart of Metternich's troubles was his staunch conservatism. For him, the world was a stage where monarchs played leading roles, and the rest of society was the supporting cast. But the revolutionary movements of 1848 were demanding a rewrite of the script. They wanted a plot twist featuring liberty, equality, and a newfound love for the liberalism that Metternich had spent his life trying to stamp out. Let's talk numbers, shall we? By 1848, Vienna was a city of around 400,000 souls, a bustling hub of Habsburg power and prestige. But beneath its polished veneer, there was unrest brewing. Economic hardships, including a potato blight and rising bread prices, had soured the mood of the populace. Picture a loaf of bread suddenly costing a small fortune, and you can imagine the grumbling in the streets. Combine that with a growing demand for political reform, and you had a powder keg waiting for a spark. And spark it did. On March 13, 1848, the streets of Vienna erupted. Students, workers, and disillusioned citizens took to the streets, demanding change and, somewhat poetically, Metternich's resignation. It was a scene straight out of a revolutionary playbook. Barricades in the streets, protesters shouting slogans, and Metternich, the seasoned diplomat, caught off guard by the sheer force of public discontent. Metternich's downfall, when it came, was swift and unceremonious. Facing mounting pressure, and realizing that his political theatrics were no longer enough to pacify the masses, Metternich did what any prudent statesman might do when the ground shifts beneath them. He resigned. It was March 18, 1848, the day the master of diplomacy faced the ultimate diplomatic defeat. The man who had once held Europe's peace in his hands was now out of a job. His influence evaporated like mist in the morning sun. But where does a deposed diplomat go when the proverbial curtain falls? For Metternich, exile was the only option. He fled to England, a country that, while certainly not free of its own political dramas, was at least a safe haven for a weary political veteran. It was a journey of around 200 kilometers, a distance that perhaps gave Metternich time to reflect on the irony of his situation. a man exiled by the very forces he tried to keep at bay. And oh, the irony was rich. Metternich, who had once wielded power with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker, now found himself in a land where the monarchy was more ceremonial than commanding. His conservative policies, which had once ensured stability, were now relics of a bygone era. It was a humbling fall from grace for a man who had been at the center of European politics for nearly 4 decades. Yet, even in exile, Metternich remained a figure of fascination. His legacy was a complex tapestry woven from the threads of diplomacy and despotism, a testament to his ability to navigate the turbulent waters of international relations. But as he settled into his new life, one couldn't help but wonder if Metternich ever pondered the ultimate lesson of his career, that the only constant in politics is change, a truth as eternal as the tides. As the revolutionary fervor of 1848 continued to sweep across Europe, Metternich's absence left a power vacuum that others were eager to fill. The Habsburg monarchy scrambled to adapt to the new political landscape, but without Metternich's steady hand. Their attempts were often clumsy and reactive. The old order was crumbling, and the forces of nationalism and liberalism were seizing the moment with an enthusiasm that would have left Metternich shaking his head in disbelief. So, what happened to the world Metternich had so carefully crafted? In his absence, Europe was like a game of political musical chairs, with nations vying for power and influence in a rapidly shifting landscape. The revolutions of 1848 were a wake-up call for the old guard, a reminder that the winds of change were blowing with a force that could not be ignored. Looking back, Metternich's downfall was both a personal tragedy and a historical inevitability. His refusal to adapt to the changing times, his steadfast belief in the old ways, and his inability to foresee the tidal wave of change that was about to crash down upon him were all contributing factors. It was a classic case of a man out of time, a diplomat whose skills, though formidable, were ultimately no match for the relentless march of progress. In the end, Metternich's story is a cautionary tale for anyone who seeks to hold back the tides of change. It's a reminder that history is not a static tableau, but a living, breathing entity that defies prediction and demands adaptation. Metternich may have been a master of diplomacy, but even he could not escape the truth that sometimes the only way to survive is to embrace the change you fear the most. As Metternich watched from afar, the Europe he once knew was transforming before his eyes. The revolutions of 1848 had sparked a fire that would burn for years to come, reshaping the continent in ways both profound and unpredictable. For Metternich, it was a poignant conclusion to a career that had been as tumultuous as the times in which he lived. The dance of diplomacy had come to an end, but the lessons of his life, both the successes and the failures, would linger on, a testament to the enduring complexity of human history. Metternich's world, like an elaborate house of cards, was collapsing, and he was left to watch from a distance, pondering the ironies of his life's work. Here was a man whose entire career was built on maintaining the status quo, yet he was now witnessing a continent in transformation, with new ideologies vying for dominance. His legacy, much like the Europe he had sought to preserve, was a patchwork quilt of triumphs and contradictions. It's a reminder that in politics, as in life, the only certainty is uncertainty. For starters, Metternich's legacy in maintaining peace is undeniable. The Congress of Vienna in 1815, where he played the diplomatic equivalent of a symphony conductor, set the stage for nearly a century of relative peace in Europe, a period historians romantically dubbed the Concert of Europe. It was a time when nations managed to balance their rivalries without descending into the kind of chaos that had marked the Napoleonic Wars. This was Metternich's magnum opus, his gift to a continent weary of conflict. The treaties signed at Vienna didn't just redraw borders. They established a framework for international cooperation that, for the most part, kept the peace until the outbreak of World War I in 1914. But here's the rub. Metternich's peace came at a price, one that many would argue was too high. His repressive tactics, designed to maintain the balance of power, also stifled the burgeoning forces of nationalism and liberalism. His was a world where censorship reigned supreme and secret police lurked in the shadows, ever watchful for signs of dissent. It was a strategy that worked, until it didn't. The revolutions of 1848 were a stark reminder that you can't keep a lid on human aspiration forever. When people want change, they're going to demand it, whether you like it or not. Metternich's policies were, in a sense, a double-edged sword. While they preserved stability, they also delayed the inevitable march toward modern nation-states, a transformation that was already well underway. The forces of nationalism were like a river dammed up by Metternich's diplomacy, only to spill over in a torrent once the dam finally broke. It's a cautionary tale about the dangers of clinging too tightly to power and the perils of standing in the way of progress. Economically, the Metternich era was a mixed bag. The Austrian Empire he sought to bolster was a sprawling entity comprising various ethnicities and cultures, each with its own economic interests. Metternich's policies were often aimed at preserving Habsburg dominance, sometimes at the expense of economic modernization. The Industrial Revolution, which was transforming Britain and other parts of Europe, arrived late in Austria, partly due to Metternich's conservative policies. Industrialization might have been a disruptive force, but it was also a driver of progress and prosperity, something Austria would eventually have to reckon with. Metternich's downfall was, in many ways, a microcosm of the challenges faced by empires throughout history. The Austrian Empire was a melting pot of cultures and languages, each with its own aspirations. Metternich's failure to address these aspirations head-on was a critical misstep. The revolutions of 1848 were a wake-up call not just for Austria, but for all of Europe, signaling that the age of empires was giving way to an era of national self-determination. In reflecting on Metternich's legacy, it's clear that his life offers valuable lessons for modern diplomacy. His ability to maintain peace through balance and negotiation is a testament to the power of diplomacy over warfare. In a world that often seems divided, Metternich's emphasis on dialogue and consensus building serves as a reminder that lasting peace is built not on domination, but on mutual respect and understanding. Yet, his story also warns against the dangers of inflexibility and the refusal to adapt to changing times. Metternich's steadfast commitment to the old order ultimately left him out of sync with the forces reshaping Europe. Change, as he learned too late, is an unstoppable force, and those who ignore it do so at their peril. His life is a reminder that while the past offers valuable lessons, it cannot be a blueprint for the future. So, what do we make of Clemens von Metternich, the man who once held the fate of Europe in his hands? Was he a visionary diplomat who kept the peace, or a reactionary force who stifled progress? The truth, as is often the case in history, is somewhere in between. Metternich was a product of his time, a man who understood the intricacies of power and the delicate dance of diplomacy. His methods were not without merit, but they were also not without consequence. In the grand tapestry of history, Metternich's legacy is a complex weave of stability and repression, triumph and failure. He reminds us that the art of diplomacy is as much about knowing when to hold firm as it is about knowing when to embrace change. As we look to the challenges of our own time, Metternich's story serves as both an inspiration and a caution, a testament to the enduring complexity of human history and the perpetual dance of power and politics. If you tried to build a city today using the same blueprints from 1894 BCE, you'd likely end up with a lot of confused architects and, well, some pretty hefty zoning fines. But if you were Hammurabi, you be hailed as the founder of one of ancient history's most legendary empires. The Babylonian Empire, cue the dramatic music, wasn't just about hanging gardens and epic parties. Oh no, it was a complex, bustling hub of innovation, law, and yes, some rather stern economic strategies. Let's start with Hammurabi himself, the man who kicked it all off. In 1894 BCE, he wasn't just some dude with a crown. He was the sixth king in a line that was taking over Mesopotamia like it was the latest trend. Under his rule, Babylon transformed from a small city-state nestled on the Euphrates into an empire that spanned from the Persian Gulf to the borders of modern-day Syria. Quite the real estate portfolio, right? Hammurabi wasn't just swinging swords and throwing banquets. He was busy writing one of the earliest and most comprehensive sets of laws, Hammurabi's Code. This wasn't your average, no loitering sign. We're talking 282 laws etched onto a stela, a big owl rock for public viewing. And trust me, It wasn't just eye for an eye justice, though that was in there too. Now, if you think Babylon was all Sin City like some ancient Vegas, hold your horses. Sure, they had their share of revelries, but this was a place of serious business. While the Greeks later painted a picture of debauchery, Babylon was more like a Silicon Valley of its time, minus the tech, and with more clay tablets. This was a society deeply invested in trade and agriculture. Thanks to the Fertile Crescent, Babylon was a breadbasket that supported large populations with their ziggurats, those iconic multi-layered towers that weren't just vanity projects. They were funded by a sophisticated economy that balanced agriculture, trade, and some rather intense tax codes. Picture this: Babylonian scribes hunched over clay tablets, crunching numbers in what can only be described as ancient Excel sheets. Not exactly a wild party, but definitely the backbone of their grand structures. Hammurabi's code was the legal backbone of this burgeoning empire, and boy, was it thorough. It covered everything from property rights to trade regulations, even diving into family law. This wasn't just about keeping the peace. It was about creating a society where contracts were sacred and disputes could be settled without resorting to the old-fashioned method of who's got the bigger army. It's fascinating to think about the bureaucratic machine that must have been in place to enforce these rules. Imagine the Babylonian DMV, lines of people, perhaps goats, waiting to register their carts or file grievances about livestock theft. And while we're on the subject, the Babylonian economy didn't just run on good intentions and well-written laws. They had silver to back it up, used as a standard currency, facilitating trade across the empire's vast networks. What makes Hammurabi's era particularly riveting is his savvy use of alliances and military might to expand his domain. He wasn't just a legal eagle, but a strategic wizard on the battlefield. By the time of his death in 1750 BCE, Hammurabi had succeeded in unifying much of Mesopotamia under Babylonian rule. Yet, like many empires, its grandeur was as fragile as a clay tablet in a sandstorm. The empire began to face challenges almost immediately after his passing. Successors struggled to maintain the same level of control and cohesion, and the empire's borders began to contract quicker than a wool sweater in hot water. So, what do we take away from this whirlwind tour of Babylon's origin story? Well, for starters, it's a reminder that civilizations are built on more than just grandiose visions. They require the nitty-gritty details, laws, economics, governance, to hold them together. Babylon's early success was not merely a result of Hammurabi's conquests, but his ability to lay down a framework that allowed a complex society to flourish. It's a testament to the power of law and order, even when it's etched in stone rather than printed on paper. But remember, Babylon was no utopia. It was a place of contradictions, an empire where groundbreaking legal systems existed alongside harsh punishments, where economic prosperity was often built on the backs of the laboring masses. It's easy to romanticize the past, to imagine Babylon as a city of endless feasts and monumental architecture. Yet, behind the stone tablets and towering ziggurats were real people navigating the everyday challenges of a sprawling empire. As we wrap up this chapter on Babylon's rise, it's clear that Hammurabi's legacy was one of complexity and paradox, setting the stage for centuries of both admiration and myth. And while his empire's story continues to echo through the ages, one thing's for sure: Hammurabi knew how to lay down the law, quite literally. So, the next time you're caught in bureaucratic red tape, just remember, it could be worse. You could be deciphering a clay tablet in Babylon, trying to figure out if you owe taxes on that herd of sheep. Yet our story is far from over. Fast forward a few centuries, and we find ourselves in the era of Nebuchadnezzar Roman II, the rock star of Babylonian kings. His reign from 605 to 562 BCE marked the golden age of Babylon. Think of him as the guy who took Hammurabi's blueprint and said, "Hold my beer." Under Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon wasn't just a city. It was the city, the New York of its time, minus the yellow cabs, but definitely with the towering structures. Let's dive headfirst into the legend that's probably popped up on your Instagram feed, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. The supposed wonder of the ancient world that's been the subject of so much debate, you'd think it was a modern conspiracy theory. Did these lush terraces even exist? That's the million-shekel question. Ancient texts from the likes of Berossus and Strabo paint a picture of verdant greenery cascading from balconies, supported by an ingenious irrigation system that could rival your favorite Rube Goldberg machine. But here's the catch. There's no definitive archaeological evidence to back this up. Kind of like those UFO sightings, plenty of stories, but no concrete proof. Some historians suggest the gardens may have existed in Nineveh, not Babylon. Whoops, wrong empire. Whether a figment of imagination or a marvel lost to time, the gardens capture our imagination like a good mystery novel. Beyond the potential greenery, Nebuchadnezzar was busy making sure Babylon was the cultural and architectural marvel of its age. One of his crowning glories was the Ishtar Gate, an awe-inspiring structure adorned with glazed bricks depicting dragons and bulls. This was no DIY project from your local home improvement store. It was a colossal gateway into the city, a statement piece that screamed, "We're kind of a big deal." Archaeologists say it was about 50 feet high. That's like stacking a few T-Rex dinosaurs on top of each other, give or take a scale. Under Nebuchadnezzar's rule, Babylon became a hub of cultural and technological advancements. The city was laid out with a precision that would make urban planners weep with joy. The streets were meticulously organized, the infrastructure was robust, and the Euphrates River was tamed to serve the city's needs. This wasn't just about looking pretty, it was about showing off their prowess in engineering and urban planning. Babylonian astronomers were mapping the stars with an accuracy that would put your horoscope app to shame. Their calculations in mathematics and astronomy laid the groundwork for future civilizations to build on, proving that even in ancient times, science was cool. But let's not forget the man behind the empire. Nebuchadnezzar wasn't just building for the sake of it. He was constructing a legacy, one brick at a time, fueled by an ego that could fill the Euphrates. This guy had ambition and vision, and a penchant for grandiosity that could rival any modern-day billionaire. He expanded his empire through military conquests, securing territories and wealth that kept Babylon at the center of the ancient world. Yet, it wasn't all glory and gold. His campaigns often left a trail of destruction and displacement, a reality far less glamorous than the tales of victory. Speaking of harsh realities, let's talk about Babylon's social hierarchy. At the top, you had the king, Nebuchadnezzar, in this case, followed by a tier of priests and scribes who kept the wheels of bureaucracy turning. Then came the merchants and artisans, the folks who made the economy hum. Last but not least were the farmers and laborers, whose hard work was the foundation of Babylon's prosperity. This wasn't a society of equals. It was a well-oiled machine with each cog knowing its place. And while the top enjoyed the spoils of empire, the bottom often bore the brunt of its ambitions. Now, let's not sugarcoat it. Life in Babylon wasn't all feasts and festivals. It was a society with its share of inequities and challenges. The empire's prosperity was built on the backs of those who toiled in the fields, crafted the bricks, and served the elites. But it was also a place where culture flourished, where ideas could take root and grow. Babylon was a paradox, a city of both opulence and oppression, innovation and inequality. As we wrap up this glimpse into Babylon's zenith, it's clear that Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon was a place of contrasts, a city that stood as a beacon of ancient achievements, yet was also a reminder of the human cost of empire building. And while the stories of hanging gardens and grand gates continue to captivate us, it's the people and their stories that truly bring Babylon to life. So, as we leave Nebuchadnezzar's era, remember this. The real wonder of Babylon wasn't just in its structures, but in the vibrant, complex society that thrived within its walls. Stay tuned, because the saga of Babylon is far from over, and trust me, there are more twists and turns than a Babylonian irrigation canal. Fast forward from the zenith of Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon, and we find ourselves at the doorstep of 539 BCE, a year that would go down in history as the one where Babylon got a reality check courtesy of Cyrus the Great and his Persian entourage. If Babylon was the ancient equivalent of a rock star, then Cyrus was the new kid on the block with a penchant for hostile takeovers. He wasn't just any ruler, he was the founder of the Achaemenid Empire, a political strategist with ambitions as wide as his empire would soon be. Imagine the audacity. Here was a man who looked at Babylon, the city that was the toast of the ancient world, and thought, yeah, I'll take that. Now, let's not pretend Cyrus just waltzed into Babylon like he owned the place. There was a fair share of cloak and dagger, minus the cloaks, since this was the Mesopotamian desert, after all. Babylon was already wobbling like a three-legged stool. Internal strife was brewing, and Nabonidus, the last king of Babylon, wasn't exactly winning any popularity contests. He had a knack for alienating the priesthood, and a talent for ignoring his subjects' grievances, sort of like a king-sized ostrich with his head in the sand. Cyrus, ever the opportunist, saw his chance and seized it with both hands. His army was no ragtag bunch. It was a well-oiled machine, and he knew how to use it. The Battle of Opis in September 539 BCE was a decisive affair, as Cyrus's forces effectively routed the Babylonian army, paving the way for a peaceful entry into Babylon. And when I say peaceful, I mean Cyrus pulled off one of history's greatest PR stunts. He portrayed himself as a liberator, not a conqueror, claiming he was restoring order and honoring Babylonian gods. It was like those reality TV makeovers, but with a lot more stakes and fewer hair products. The famous Cyrus cylinder, sometimes dubbed the first charter of human rights, was Cyrus's piece de resistance. It declared his intentions to free the oppressed and restore temples, a political manifesto etched in clay. This was no mere conquest. It was a masterclass in winning hearts and minds. And guess what? It worked. The Babylonians, weary of Nabonidus's rule, welcomed Cyrus with open arms, or at least without much of a fuss. It was less of a hostile takeover and more of a corporate merger, with Cyrus as the new CEO promising better management and benefits. However, let's not get carried away with the romance of Cyrus's benevolence. While he might have presented himself as a liberator, his motivations were as much about expanding his empire as they were about justice and mercy. The Babylonians got a new ruler, sure, but they also became a cog in the vast Achaemenid machine. The romantic narrative of a peaceful transition is charming, but the reality was a calculated power grab, pure and simple. And what about Babylon's famous walls, the ones Herodotus claimed were so wide that a four-horse chariot could turn on top of them? Turns out, Herodotus had a flair for exaggeration. Think of him as the ancient world's version of a tabloid journalist. The walls were impressive, no doubt, but not quite the impenetrable fortress he described. Cyrus's engineers simply diverted the Euphrates River, allowing his troops to enter the city through the riverbed. It was a stroke of genius, and not a single stone needed to be dislodged. Take that, Herodotus. Now, as much as we revel in Cyrus's cunning and the dramatic fall of a mighty city, let's talk about why Babylon was ripe for the picking. Internally, the empire was cracking under its own weight. Economic pressures were mounting, and the social fabric was fraying. Nabonidus had spent years neglecting the cult of Marduk, Babylon's chief deity, which was about as popular as declaring Christmas cancelled. His absence from Babylon for extended periods didn't help either. It's like the CEO who's always working remotely, but never actually in the office. Externally, Babylon was facing pressure from all sides. The Median Empire had already fallen to Cyrus, and the Lydians weren't far behind. The geopolitical chessboard was shifting, and Babylon found itself in a precarious position, surrounded by a rapidly expanding Persian empire that was swallowing territories like an ancient game of Pac-Man. In the end, Babylon's decline wasn't just the result of one bad king or a single battle lost. It was a combination of internal decay and external aggression, a cautionary tale of how even the greatest empires can crumble when they're unable to adapt to changing realities. The takeover by Cyrus marked the end of Babylon as an independent entity and the beginning of its life as a provincial capital in a vast empire. As we sift through the ruins of Babylon's past, it's a reminder that history's great narratives are often more layered and less clear-cut than we'd like to believe. The romantic image of Babylon as an eternal city of wonder is compelling, but it's the gritty reality of political intrigue, economic challenges, and military strategy that holds the real lessons. So, next time you hear about the glory that was Babylon, remember, behind every grand story is a complex tapestry of people, politics, and power plays. And while Babylon may have been reduced from a powerhouse to a historical footnote, its legacy lives on, a testament to the enduring allure of its myths and the harsh realities of its decline. But hold on to your hats, because this saga isn't over yet. There are still more twists, more turns, and more tales to tell as we continue our journey through the annals of history. Stay tuned, because Babylon's story still has a few surprises left. As we dive into the aftermath of Babylon's conquest, let's take a moment to appreciate the irony that while Babylon lost its independence, it gained immortality in the annals of history. It's like the city got a posthumous star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. Babylon's legacy, while tarnished by conquest, left a cultural imprint that echoed through millennia, shaping religions, literature, and even modern pop culture. First off, let's talk about Babylon's cultural contributions. Ever heard of the Epic of Gilgamesh? This ancient Mesopotamian narrative is one of the earliest pieces of literature we know, predating Homer by about a millennium. It's a tale of friendship, adventure, and the quest for immortality, kind of like an ancient buddy cop movie, but with more tablets and fewer explosions. Babylonian scribes helped preserve and circulate this epic, ensuring that Gilgamesh's adventures would inspire writers from Virgil to Tolkien. Then there's the Babylonian astronomical legacy. Babylonian astronomers weren't just stargazers. They were the original cosmic accountants, recording celestial movements with the precision of a Swiss watch. Their work laid the groundwork for the development of astrology and contributed significantly to the field of astronomy. The zodiac signs that you check every morning. You can thank the Babylonians for those, too. They divided the sky into 12 sections that became the zodiac signs we know today, proving that even in ancient times, people loved a good horoscope. Now, on to the juicy stuff. How Babylon became synonymous with decadence and vice. The city's reputation for excess and moral decline is largely due to later interpretations. The Hebrew Bible, for instance, paints Babylon as the ultimate bad boy of cities. Think Sodom and Gomorrah, but with more ziggurats. In the Book of Revelation, Babylon is the whore of Babylon, a symbol of sin and corruption. Talk about a bad PR campaign. This villainous portrayal was less about historical accuracy and more about symbolism, using Babylon as a stand-in for any oppressive, morally bankrupt power. The Romans, too, got in on the act. They saw Babylon as a cautionary tale of luxury gone mad, an anti-role model for their own empire. For Rome, which was expanding at breakneck speed, Babylon was a reminder of the dangers of overindulgence and hubris. It's as if Babylon became the poster child for every empire's midlife crisis, a warning of what happens when you spend too much on chariots and not enough on governance. But let's not throw all the blame on religious texts and Roman moralists. Babylon had a hand in crafting its own image, too. The city's splendor, its monumental architecture, and its bustling markets were well documented by ancient travelers. Herodotus, that master storyteller, couldn't resist embellishing tales of its grandeur, even if he sometimes played fast and loose with the facts. It's like the ancient version of a tourist exaggerating their vacation photos. No, really, the Hanging Gardens were the size of a football field. Speaking of those gardens, the myth of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon continues to captivate imaginations. Despite the lack of archaeological evidence, the idea of a lush, terraced garden in the middle of a desert city is irresistible. It's a testament to Babylon's ability to craft legends as enduring as its bricks. Some scholars suggest that if the gardens existed, they might have been more about Nebuchadnezzar Roman II diplomatic prowess, perhaps a gift for his Median wife, Amides, who missed her mountainous homeland. Whether fact or fiction, the gardens symbolize Babylon's mastery of engineering and artistry. Archaeology, however, offers a sobering reality check. Excavations of Babylon reveal a city of impressive infrastructure and meticulous urban planning. The famed Ishtar Gate, with its dazzling blue bricks, was a testament to Babylonian craftsmanship and artistic flair. But beyond the glamour, digs have uncovered the gritty details of daily life, evidence of a society dependent on a rigid social hierarchy and an economy that could be as unforgiving as the Mesopotamian sun. Tablets unearthed from the city's ruins reveal contracts, legal disputes, and economic transactions, painting a picture of a bustling metropolis fueled by trade and agriculture. The archaeological record also sheds light on the city's religious life. Temples dedicated to Marduk and other deities were at the heart of Babylonian culture, serving as both religious centers and economic powerhouses. The ziggurat, known as Edemenenki, is often associated with the biblical Tower of Babel. This massive structure was not just a testament to human ambition, but also an architectural marvel, a symbol of the city's connection to the divine. As we sift through the ruins, it becomes clear that Babylon was a city of contrasts, a place of remarkable achievements, yet fraught with the same social and political tensions that plague societies today. Its legacy, a blend of myth and reality, continues to spark the imagination and fuel debates about the nature of power and civilization. And let's not forget Babylon's influence on later civilizations. The city's legal and administrative systems, honed under Hammurabi and his successors, set a precedent for governance that influenced Persian, Greek, and Roman administration. The concept of a centralized state with codified laws was a Babylonian gift that kept on giving. Even Alexander the Great, who fancied himself a world conqueror, saw Babylon as a model city. He envisioned it as the capital of his sprawling empire, though fate had other plans when he died there in 323 BCE. The allure of Babylon didn't dim with its fall. Instead, it grew, a testament to the city's enduring mystique. It became a canvas upon which successive generations projected their hopes, fears, and fantasies. The city's name became shorthand for opulence and moral decay, a cautionary tale wrapped in the guise of legend. So, as we wrap up this chapter and prepare to delve into the final part of Babylon's saga, let's remember this. The real Babylon, with all its complexities and contradictions, is more fascinating than any myth. It's a reminder that history, like the city itself, is a tapestry of triumphs and failures, glory and ruin. And while Babylon may have crumbled into dust, its story continues to captivate us, a testament to the power of human imagination and the allure of the ancient world. Stay tuned. There's more to uncover as we journey deeper into the echoes of Babylon's past. The story of Babylon, with its rich tapestry of myth and reality, leaves us pondering its true legacy and its ripple effect through time. Babylon wasn't just a flash in the pan of history. It was a beacon that illuminated paths for future civilizations. Let's dig into what the Babylonians left us besides a few broken ziggurats and a reputation for throwing wild parties. Start with the legal system. Ever heard of Hammurabi's Code? Of course you have. It's the granddaddy of all legal codes, not just a list of do's and don'ts, a comprehensive guide to living in a society where you ideally don't want to end up in a neighborly feud over a goat. This was around 1750 BCE, folks. Yet here we are, thousands of years later, and the core idea remains. Laws are meant to bring order to chaos. Babylon's legal legacy was the ancient world's version of a blockbuster franchise, inspiring the legal systems of the Hittites and Assyrians, and echoing even in Roman law. The code laid down principles like presumption of innocence and the right to present evidence, concepts we still hold dear. While we've thankfully moved past the whole eye for an eye bit, the spirit of Hammurabi's laws is alive and kicking every time you step into a courtroom. Next, let's stroll down the streets of Babylon, metaphorically of course, and talk urban planning. Babylonian engineers weren't just about building big, they were about building smart. The city was organized in a grid pattern, a precursor to the modern city layout. Efficient streets, reliable sewage systems, and an irrigation network that was the envy of the ancient world. These were not just about aesthetics. They were about practicality, ensuring the city could function smoothly even as its population swelled like a balloon at a birthday party. Modern cities owe a nod to Babylon every time we enjoy the convenience of a well-paved road or a well-timed traffic light. They set the standard for integrating urban functionality with grandeur, a balance many cities still strive to strike. Speaking of functionality, let's turn our gaze skyward. Babylonian astronomers weren't just the nerds of their time. They were the rock stars of the celestial scene. Their detailed star charts and lunar calendars were the foundation for modern astronomy. They tracked celestial movements with such precision that they could predict solar eclipses. Today, when you check your smartphone's weather app or read your horoscope, remember that the Babylonians set those cosmic wheels in motion. They taught us to look up, to measure, and to dream beyond our earthly constraints. But what about the lessons from Babylon's decline? History, after all, is a stern teacher. Babylon's fall is a cautionary tale about the dangers of over-reliance on military might and the neglect of the populace's needs. Sound familiar? It should. Empires throughout history, from Rome to the British Empire, have learned the hard way that ignoring internal strife can be more damaging than any external threat. Babylon's story reminds us that the strength of an empire lies not just in its walls or its armies, but in the welfare of its people. Neglect that, and you might find yourself in the history books as a cautionary tale. Now, let's pull back the curtain on the myths. Babylon as a symbol of excess and debauchery is as tantalizing as a tabloid headline. The truth, however, is less sensational. Yes, Babylon was a city of wealth and power, but it was also a place of cultural and intellectual renown. The image of Babylon as a den of vice was largely the result of historical bias and religious metaphor. The Hebrew Bible and later interpretations painted Babylon as the ultimate antagonist, but this was less about historical accuracy and more about using Babylon as a symbol for moral and spiritual lessons. Babylon's real story is one of human resilience and innovation, a reminder that beneath the glamour and the legend, it was a city of people striving, failing, and succeeding. So, what do we take away from Babylon's epic saga? It's a reminder that human ambition and folly are two sides of the same coin. Babylon's grandeur was matched only by its eventual downfall, a testament to both the heights of human achievement and the depths of our hubris. The city's legacy is a complex blend of real accomplishments and mythical allure. It's a city that dared to reach for the stars, sometimes stumbled, but left an indelible mark on the world. In the grand tapestry of history, Babylon is a vivid thread, woven with stories of power, innovation, and caution. It's a symbol of the eternal dance between creation and destruction, a dance that every civilization must learn to navigate. So next time you find yourself in a bustling city, or a courtroom, or gazing at the night sky, tip your hat to Babylon, for its spirit is etched in the annals of time and whispers still in the echoes of our modern world. As we close the book on Babylon, remember this: empires rise and fall, but their stories, their lessons, and their legacies continue to shape the world. Babylon may have crumbled, but its essence lives on, a timeless symbol of human endeavor and error. And that, dear listeners, is the true magic of history. It's never really over. There's always another twist, another tale, waiting just around the corner. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep the fires of curiosity burning bright. The ornate halls of Embley Park echoed with the chatter of Victorian high society, a world where a young woman like Florence Nightingale was expected to master the art of embroidery, not the intricacies of epidemiology. This was a time when the only thing more scandalous than a torn hem was a lady showing too much interest in something as unladylike as nursing. But Florence, born on May 12, 1820, in Florence, Italy. Yeah, her parents weren't exactly subtle with names, had other ideas. Her family was part of the English elite, which meant they had a very specific set of life goals for her, none of which involved hospitals. Florence was the second of two daughters born to William Edward Nightingale and Frances Smith, who were, by all accounts, the kind of parents who thought that a good marriage was the pinnacle of a woman's life. While her sister, Parthenope, named after the Greek city now known as Naples, clearly the Nightingales had a theme going, seemed content to play the part of a genteel lady. Florence was more interested in the world beyond the drawing room. Let's be clear. Florence was no rebellious teenager sulking in her room with the Victorian equivalent of punk music. Instead, she was academically gifted, a fact that became apparent when she was reading philosophical texts while other kids her age were still grappling with their ABCs. Her father, to his credit, saw her potential and took it upon himself to educate her in subjects like mathematics, history, and multiple languages. He probably thought this was just a way to make her more marriageable. Little did he know he was inadvertently setting her up for a future much more radical than a good match. Now, picture this. It's the 1830, and Florence is telling her parents she feels a calling to become a nurse. Today, that might sound like a noble career choice. In her time, it was akin to saying she wanted to become a professional pickpocket. Nursing was considered a low-status job, often filled by women who were, let's say, not in it for the career advancement. It was more grubby work than glamorous profession. Her family, naturally, freaked out. They tried everything to dissuade her. They took her on a tour of Europe, hoping the cultural riches would give her a taste for the finer things in life and not, an unquenchable thirst for sanitation reform. But the more art she saw, the more she felt that her destiny lay in improving public health. It was Florence versus the world, and spoiler alert, Florence was going to win. In 1844, Florence finally convinced her parents to let her study nursing, albeit reluctantly. She enrolled at the institution of Protestant deaconesses in Kaiserswerth, Germany. This was a place where the term medical training was applied loosely. It was more like a crash course in not fainting at the sight of blood. But for Florence, this was the holy grail. She spent 3 transformative months learning everything she could about patient care, sanitation, and hospital administration. This period was crucial. It was here she first grasped the link between cleanliness and health, a connection that was revolutionary at the time. Florence returned to England armed with new skills and a determination as steely as the scalpels she would one day wield. Her family still hoped this was just a phase, like the time she insisted on cutting her own bangs or that brief flirtation with vegetarianism. But Florence was nothing if not persistent. She started working at a hospital in Harley Street, London, in 1853, where she quickly made a name for herself as someone who could transform a chaotic ward into a model of efficiency. By now, Florence was well on her way to becoming the legend we know. But it wasn't all Nightingale songs and lamplit vigils. She was a woman in a man's world, fighting against the tide of societal norms that said her place was at home. Her early life was a testament to both her privilege and her defiance of it, a balancing act that would define her career. As she stood on the cusp of her monumental work during the Crimean War, it was clear that Florence Nightingale was rewriting the script on what it meant to be a woman with a purpose. Florence Nightingale was poised on the brink of her defining moment, the kind that life tends to hand you when you're least expecting it. Enter the Crimean War, an unholy mess of geopolitical squabbles with a side of cholera. When news reached Britain that soldiers were dropping faster than morale at a Monday morning meeting, the public was outraged. The government, eager to save face and perhaps a few lives, turned to Florence. In 1854, she was dispatched to the front lines, armed with little more than her wits and a small team of 38 nurses. Now, you might think Florence arrived on the scene to find an orderly chaos. Instead, she stepped into absolute pandemonium. The main hospital at Scutari, a former Turkish barracks, was a haven for everything except healing. Imagine a place so filthy that rats and lice held the majority vote. Diseases like typhus, cholera, and dysentery were the real enemies, not the Russians. Mortality rates were as high as 42%, meaning you were statistically better off trying your luck on the battlefield. Florence surveyed this nightmare with the kind of cool determination that makes you wonder if she ever even blinked. You see, she didn't just bring a lamp that would launch 1,000 nostalgic paintings. She brought a ruthless practicality that would make a modern-day efficiency expert weep with joy. First up on her agenda, sanitation. Florence understood that cleanliness was next to godliness, or at least survival. She set about scrubbing the floors, washing the linens, and ensuring that the soldiers had clean water. A simple enough concept now, but back then it was revolutionary. Thanks to her efforts, mortality rates plummeted to 2%, a drop so drastic it might as well have been witchcraft. But Florence wasn't just facing off against dirt and disease. She also had to contend with military officials who were, shall we say, skeptical of her methods. These were men who had built entire careers on the premise that women belonged in drawing rooms, not dictating hospital policy. They were not exactly thrilled with Florence's insistence that things like fresh air and clean bandages were a good idea. The pushback was intense, but Florence was undeterred. She had the stats on her side, and as any good number cruncher knows, data doesn't lie. She meticulously recorded everything, creating statistical models that would later inform modern medical practices. Her reports became the backbone of her argument, and eventually, even the most stubborn military minds had to admit she was onto something. Florence's time in the Crimean War wasn't just about saving lives. It was about changing the narrative. Before her, nursing was a disrespected vocation. After her, it was a profession. Her work laid the groundwork for what would become the modern nursing field. And while she might not have done it all alone, she was the linchpin that held the whole operation together. She turned a ragtag team of nurses into a well-oiled machine, all while battling not just the horrors of war, but also the entrenched sexism of her time. The stories of her nightly rounds with a lamp have become the stuff of legend, but the truth is even more compelling. She worked tirelessly, often 20 hours a day, checking on soldiers, administering care, and making sure that every detail was attended to. Her Lady with the Lamp nickname wasn't just about her midnight visits. It was a testament to her relentless dedication. Florence Nightingale wasn't just a woman with a lamp. She was a force of nature. Her ability to turn chaos into order was nothing short of miraculous. But it wasn't some divine intervention. It was grit, determination, and an unwavering belief that things could and should be better. Her legacy is not just in the lives she saved, but in the systems she reformed. She showed the world that a woman armed with data and determination could outlast the darkest night. Yet, this wasn't the end of her journey. Far from it. Florence was just warming up, and the changes she sparked during the Crimean War would ripple out in ways that no one could have predicted. So stay tuned, because the story of how she transformed the medical world has only just begun. Florence Nightingale didn't just rest on her laurels after the Crimean War. She catapulted herself and her cause into the stratosphere of public consciousness, like a 19th century social media influencer, minus the selfies. Her reputation as the Lady with the Lamp was firmly enshrined, and she seized the moment with both hands. In 1856, fresh from the trenches and still reeling from the grim reality she had faced, she returned to England not as a weary war nurse, but as a reformer with a mission. She had seen firsthand the horrors of war, and more importantly, she had seen what worked and what didn't. Her goal was clear: overhaul the healthcare system that had so spectacularly failed the soldiers. Now, if you think getting people on board with modern healthcare ideas is hard today, imagine trying it in 19th century England, where people still thought that bathing was an optional luxury and leeches were a medical staple. Florence had her work cut out for her, but she wasn't just a woman with a lamp. She was a woman with a plan. Armed with her detailed notes and statistics from the war, she set out to educate the public and the government on the urgent need for health reforms. And she was relentless. Florence wrote a 900-page report, notes on matters affecting the health, efficiency, and hospital administration of the British Army. If that sounds like a mouthful, it was. But it was also the kind of document that changed minds and policies. In it, she laid bare the inefficiencies and insanities of the military medical services, and she didn't hold back. Her efforts led to the establishment of the Royal Commission on the Health of the Army in 1857, which she influenced heavily from behind the scenes. Because, of course, the Victorian era was all about the optics of male leadership, even if the brains behind the operation wore petticoats. Her statistical diagrams, which she used to illustrate mortality rates and causes, were revolutionary. They were basically the 19th century equivalent of a killer PowerPoint presentation. Used these to prove that more soldiers died from preventable diseases than battle wounds, a fact that made the government sit up and take notice. Fast forward to 1860, and Florence was ready to take the next big step. She realized that if she wanted to make a lasting change, she needed to tackle the root of the problem: the training and education of nurses. Enter the Nightingale Training School for Nurses at St. Thomas Hospital in London. This was no small feat. At the time, the idea of a formal training school for nurses was as radical as suggesting that medical professionals wash their hands. Oh wait, she advocated for that too. The school was funded by the Nightingale Fund, which had been established from the £45,000 of public donations she received in recognition of her work during the Crimean War. Adjusted for inflation, that's around £5 million today. That's a lot of money to say thank you for saving lives and turning the tide of healthcare, and Florence put it to good use. The training school was designed to professionalize nursing, turning it from what was essentially a fallback career for women who had few other options into a respectable profession. This was not just about teaching women how to fluff pillows or apply bandages. It was about instilling a sense of duty, discipline, and knowledge that could rival any medical training of the time. But let's not pretend it was all smooth sailing. Victorian society had a hard time wrapping its head around the concept of educated women in the workforce. The challenges Florence faced were both laughable and infuriating. Critics questioned whether women could handle the physical and emotional demands of nursing, as if women hadn't been managing households and raising children with one hand tied behind their back for centuries. There were also bizarre objections based on the idea that educated women would become unfeminine or, worse, unmarriageable. The horror. Despite these challenges, the Nightingale Training School was a success. It started with just 15 students, but it quickly became the gold standard for nursing education. Graduates from the school went on to start their own training programs in hospitals across the UK and beyond, spreading Florence's methods and philosophy like a very healthy, very beneficial virus. By the end of the 19th century, trained nurses were a fixture in hospitals, and the profession had gained newfound respectability. Florence didn't just change how nurses were trained, she changed how they were perceived. Her work elevated the status of nursing from a menial job to a crucial component of healthcare, and she did it all while battling her own health issues. After the Crimean War, she was plagued by what was likely chronic fatigue syndrome, a condition that left her bedridden for long periods. But even from her bed, she continued to write, advocate, and push for change. Talk about dedication. Humorous irony in all of this is that, while Florence was modernizing healthcare, much of the medical world was still clinging to outdated practices. In some circles, doctors were still debating the merits of bloodletting, a practice that Florence had long since consigned to the dustbin of history. Her push for hygiene and sanitation was sometimes met with skepticism, especially from those who saw germs as little more than an inconvenient theory. It was a clash of old versus new, and Florence was squarely on the side of progress. Florence Nightingale's post-war period was a testament to her tenacity and vision. She took the fame she had garnered and turned it into a platform for change, using her influence to reshape the landscape of healthcare. Her legacy was not just the lives she saved during the war, but the thousands more saved through her reforms. She was a trailblazer in every sense of the word, proving that even in the face of societal resistance, one determined person could make a world of difference. The story of Florence Nightingale is far from over, and as we continue to explore her impact, the lessons she taught us about compassion, data-driven decision-making, and the power of education remain as relevant as ever. So stay tuned, because there's more to uncover in the remarkable journey of the lady with the lamp. As Florence Nightingale's legacy began to take root, she found herself in an unexpected role, the Queen of the Sick. You see, after the Crimean War, Florence was struck by what was likely chronic fatigue syndrome, though at the time, the medical community was about as mystified by it as a cat at a dog show. Despite her condition, Florence didn't let a little thing like debilitating illness keep her from changing the world. Instead, she turned her bedroom into a command center for reform, wielding influence from her bed in ways that would make even the most seasoned CEO envious. Florence's primary weapon in this battle was her pen. Her correspondence was monumental. She wrote over 14,000 letters in her lifetime, turning her personal struggle into a platform for public health advocacy. That's right. While most of us struggle to answer a few emails, Florence was orchestrating healthcare reform with the kind of relentless energy that makes you wonder if she was running on Victorian-era Red Bull. Her letters weren't just idle chatter. They were meticulously crafted arguments aimed at policymakers, healthcare professionals, and anyone who could help push her agenda forward. She was essentially the world's first remote worker, proving you could influence change without ever leaving your duvet. One of her most significant impacts was on the Royal Commission on the Health of the Army. Established in 1857, this commission was supposed to be the government's way of saying, "Oops, our bad," after the catastrophic failures of military healthcare during the Crimean War. But Florence wasn't content with mere apologies. She used her statistical acumen to sway opinions and policies, turning numbers into a language everyone could understand, much like a math teacher who finally makes algebra click. Her infamous coxcomb diagrams, a kind of pie chart on steroids, vividly illustrated the mortality rates before and after her interventions. They were the 19th century equivalent of a viral infographic, capturing the attention of the public and Parliament alike. Florence's statistical prowess was groundbreaking for its time, was one of the first to use data visualization to make her case, showing that more soldiers died from preventable diseases than battlefield injuries, a revelation that was as shocking as it was convincing. It's not every day you get to say that pie charts saved lives, but in Florence's case, they truly did. Her ability to translate complex data into actionable insights was nothing short of revolutionary. She effectively turned healthcare reform into a numbers game, and she played it like a maestro. Now, it's worth pausing to appreciate the irony here. At a time when women were expected to be seen and not heard, Florence was pulling the strings of public health policy with a deftness that would make Machiavelli nod in approval. From the confines of her room, she coordinated efforts that rippled across the globe, influencing practices from London to India. The very society that doubted a woman's capacity for leadership was unknowingly being led by one who rarely left her bed. Florence's influence extended far beyond the army. She was deeply involved in improving sanitation and healthcare in civilian hospitals, too. Her 1863 report on the conditions of Indian hospitals, which she wrote without ever visiting the country, was a pivotal document that spurred significant reforms. It's incredible to think that she was able to effect change on such a scale without setting foot in the places she was transforming. Her impact was global, and her reach was as wide as her determination was deep. Yet, even as she pushed for reform, Florence was acutely aware of the societal obstacles she faced. Her writings often reflected a sardonic understanding of the gender politics of her time. She once quipped that women are never supposed to have any occupation of sufficient importance not to be interrupted, a sharp observation that highlighted the constant interruptions she faced from a society that refused to take her seriously. But take her they did, eventually. Her relentless pursuit of change, backed by hard data and unwavering conviction, forced even the most resistant policymakers to acknowledge her contributions. Florence Nightingale's later years were a testament to the power of perseverance and innovation. She might have been bedridden, but she was far from powerless. Her correspondence and statistical analyses laid the groundwork for modern public health policy, demonstrating that significant change could be orchestrated from the most unlikely of places. As she continued to challenge conventions and push boundaries, Florence redefined what it meant to be a woman of influence in the Victorian era. She wasn't just the lady with the lamp. She was a beacon of reform, illuminating the path forward for generations to come. In the grand tapestry of history, Florence Nightingale's later years are a vivid illustration of how one person's vision and tenacity can alter the course of an entire field. Her ability to harness the power of data, combined with her keen understanding of human nature, allowed her to navigate the complexities of public health reform with unmatched skill. As we delve further into her story, it's clear that the lessons she imparted go beyond the annals of history. They remain relevant and inspiring even in our modern world. And while her work was far from finished, her legacy was already casting a long shadow, shaping the future of healthcare in ways that continue to resonate today. Florence Nightingale's story doesn't end with her groundbreaking work in healthcare. No, she was just getting started on her journey to becoming a near-mythical figure. As her legacy grew, so too did the lore surrounding her life. While the real Florence was a powerhouse of reform, the stories about her sometimes drifted into the realm of fairy tales. It's time to separate fact from fiction and see how her legend stacks up against reality. First, let's talk about that famous lamp. The image of Florence wandering the darkened halls of Scutari with her trusty lamp has become iconic, painting her as some sort of ethereal guardian angel of the night. But here's the thing. Florence wasn't the only nurse working those late-night shifts, and she certainly wasn't the only one carrying a lamp. In fact, her so-called lamp was probably more akin to a Turkish lantern, practical for its time, but hardly the glowing beacon of legend. Yet this romanticized image served a purpose. It captured the public's imagination and turned her into a symbol of compassion and care. In a way, the myth of the lamp was the Victorian equivalent of going viral, a catchy image that spread like wildfire and cemented her place in history. The lady with the lamp myth also glosses over the grit and grime of her real work. Florence wasn't just floating around offering a comforting presence. She was knee-deep in filth, battling bureaucracy and outdated practices with a tenacity that would scare off even the most hardened office manager. Her role as a reformer was much more about spreadsheets and sanitation than about saintly vigils. But romantic tales have their charm, and in a world that often preferred fairy tales to facts, Florence's story became a beacon of hope. Now, let's tackle the notion that Florence single-handedly revolutionized nursing. Yes, She was a trailblazer, but she wasn't working in a vacuum. There were other reformers, both men and women, who contributed to the modernization of healthcare. For instance, Elizabeth Blackwell, the first woman to receive a medical degree in the United States, was also a key figure in advancing women's roles in medicine. The myth of the lone genius is appealing. It gives us heroes to admire. But the truth is that change is often the result of collective effort. Florence was a brilliant strategist, but she stood on the shoulders of giants, many of whom have been overshadowed by her towering legacy. Speaking of towering legacies, let's not ignore the economic and social context that shaped Florence's story. Her reforms didn't happen in a vacuum. They were part of a broader movement toward modernization in Victorian Britain. The Industrial Revolution had catapulted society into an age of rapid change, creating both problems and opportunities. Public health was an emerging concern, and Florence's work dovetailed with a growing awareness of the need for systemic reform. In a sense, she was the right person at the right time, capitalizing on a societal shift toward progress and efficiency. Florence's enduring legacy is a testament to her ability to navigate complex social landscapes. She wasn't just a nurse. She was a social reformer, a statistician, and a pioneering feminist, though she might not have used that term herself. Her work laid the foundation for modern nursing, but it also challenged the status quo in ways that still resonate today. Imagine Florence in today's world of social media and viral fame. Would she be tweeting her statistical analyses, sharing infographics on Instagram, or perhaps hosting a podcast on public health? It's not hard to picture her leveraging digital platforms to amplify her message, reaching a global audience with the same fervor she showed in her letters. And here's the kicker. Florence Nightingale's story is as much about us as it is about her. The myths and legends that surround her reveal our own need for heroes, for narratives that inspire and uplift. We crave stories of singular triumph because they give us hope that change is possible, even against daunting odds. But Florence's real legacy is more nuanced. It's about the power of perseverance, the importance of data-driven decision-making, and the impact one person can have when they refuse to accept the status quo. As we wrap up this journey through Florence Nightingale's life, it's clear that her contributions to nursing and public health are immeasurable. She transformed a maligned profession into a respected field, elevating standards and expectations in ways that continue to save lives today. Her work was pioneering not just because it was innovative, but because it was driven by an unwavering commitment to human dignity and compassion. In the end, Florence Nightingale was both a product of her time and a force of nature who transcended it. Her story is one of grit, determination, and a relentless pursuit of a better world. So, let's remember her not just as the lady with the lamp, but as a beacon of change whose light continues to guide us. Whether battling ignorance with infographics or transforming healthcare from her sick, Florence Nightingale's legacy is a testament to the power of one determined individual to illuminate the darkest corners of history with the light of progress. In the world of ancient Egypt, power wasn't just about who had the fanciest headgear, although those gold and blue-striped nemes certainly didn't hurt. At the pinnacle of this society stood the pharaohs, who were part ruler, part deity, and a whole lot of ancient PR wizardry. Imagine the PR team you'd need to convince everyone you're not just a king, but a living god. The pharaohs pulled that off without even a single Instagram post. Now, let's talk divine mandate. You see, being a pharaoh wasn't just about sitting on a throne and looking fabulous, although that was definitely part of the job description. It was about maintaining mad. No, not a new yoga pose, but the ancient Egyptian concept of truth, balance, and cosmic order. Pharaohs were the living Horus, the son of Osiris, the guy who supposedly got dismembered and then reassembled. It's no wonder they had to keep everything in cosmic order. The stakes were literally life and limb. The real measure of a pharaoh's power, though, was economic. Forget personal bank accounts. These guys controlled the wealth of an entire civilization. They oversaw the collection of taxes in the form of grain, cattle, and other goods, which they then redistributed as they saw fit. Need a new temple? Call your local pharaoh. Want to build an entire city? The pharaohs got you covered. And they did it all without even a single spreadsheet. The grandeur of Egypt's pyramids and temples often leads modern folks to assume these were just cozy homes for eternity. But let's be real, They were more like massive billboards screaming, "I'm the most powerful person in the world." We're talking structures like the Great Pyramid of Giza, which stood at 481 feet and was the tallest man-made structure for about 800 years. That's longer than it takes for a Game of Thrones book to come out. But here's the kicker, the myth of the benevolent guard king who did it all for the love of his people. Let's just say it's about as accurate as a mummy's complexion. Pharaohs were more about consolidating power, controlling the population, and ensuring their legacy in stone. It was less about altruism and more about ensuring that everyone knew who was in charge. Picture a modern CEO who builds a skyscraper just to have their name on it. Sound familiar? Maintaining this godlike status wasn't all about flexing wealth, though. It required some serious logistical gymnastics. They needed a bureaucracy that would make any pencil pusher proud. There were viziers, officials, and scribes, ancient Egypt's version of middle management. These guys ensured that the pharaoh's word was law, and that everyone from the Nile Delta to the southern borders complied. Let's not forget the religious angle. The pharaohs were closely tied to the priesthood, which was a smart move because nothing says divine ruler quite like having a bunch of priests backing up your claim to godhood. It was a mutually beneficial relationship. The priests got funding for their temples, and the pharaohs got to keep their divine status. Think of it as a historical version of "you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours," but with a lot more incense and chanting. Despite the shiny facade, the reality of being a pharaoh was a bit more down-to-earth, sometimes literally. These rulers had to deal with all the nitty-gritty details of governance, from agriculture to military campaigns. Ramses Roman II, for instance, wasn't just sitting around admiring his statues. He was leading battles at the age of 14. Talk about pressure. And then there was the whole issue of succession. Keeping the family line intact was a full-time job in itself, especially when every relative seemed to have ambitions of their own. So, the next time you see a colossal statue of a pharaoh, remember that behind that serene, stoic expression was a ruler juggling cosmic order, economic power, and a good dose of personal ambition. They weren't just ancient figureheads. They were shrewd operators in a world where the stakes were as high as the pyramids they built. Behind the stoic facade of those colossal pharaoh statues, as they juggled cosmic order and ambition, was another force working its magic, the priestly class. If the pharaohs were the rock stars, these priests were the behind-the-scenes producers who made sure the show went on without a hitch. Picture them as the ancient Egyptian version of celebrity influencers, except instead of selling detox teas, they were peddling divine wisdom and heavenly favor. And let's be honest, that's a pretty hefty sales pitch. Priests in ancient Egypt held a VIP pass to the god's inner circle. They were the interpreters of divine will, the ones who could read the cosmic tea leaves, if you will. This wasn't just a matter of shaking some bones and making vague proclamations. Nope, these guys were serious power brokers. They held sway over everything from agricultural decisions to political alliances, all under the guise of keeping the gods happy. Talk about job security. Now, let's talk economics. Forget about priests just hanging out in dimly lit temples, chanting away with incense smoke curling around them. These folks were raking in serious dough. Temples weren't just spiritual centers, they were economic hubs. They owned land, collected taxes, and employed a small army of workers. By the time of the New Kingdom, around 1550 to 1070 BCE, temples controlled an estimated 30% of Egypt's arable land. That's right, these guys were ancient real estate moguls with divine connections. Who needs a Wall Street portfolio when you've got Amun-Ra on speed dial? The temples were essentially mini-economies. They employed thousands, from farmers to craftsmen to scribes. The priests were the ultimate managers, ensuring that the guards received their due while the temple coffers overflowed. It was a delicate balance, but one they managed with the finesse of a Vegas casino dealer. And just like any modern-day influencer worth their salt, they knew the power of a good collaboration. Temples partnered with the pharaohs, reinforcing each other's status and ensuring mutual prosperity. It was the ultimate hash-sponsored post of the ancient world. But of course, where there's power, there's politicking. Just because these priests were supposedly working for the gods didn't mean they weren't also working for themselves. Take the high priest of Ammon, for instance. By the time you hit the reign of Ramses Roman XI, around 1100 BCE, this guy was practically running Upper Egypt. The priests of Ammon had amassed so much wealth and influence that they were a political force unto themselves. It was like the church and state rolled into one, with a dash of family drama for good measure. The priesthood wasn't just a calling, it was a career path, and a lucrative one at that. Positions were often hereditary, passed down from father to son like a particularly divine family business. This kept the power concentrated within certain families, ensuring that the same names kept popping up in the annals of history. And let's not forget the perks: free housing, food, and a steady supply of offerings from the devout. It was the ancient equivalent of a cushy corporate job, but with better headgear. Yet, for all their influence, the priests had to keep the guards happy, figuratively and literally. That meant elaborate rituals, daily offerings, and a calendar full of festivals that would put any modern socialite's schedule to shame. The priests were the ultimate event planners, organizing everything from the Arpit festival, which could last up to 24 days, to the daily rituals that kept the temple running. They knew that a happy guard was a generous guard, and they worked tirelessly to make sure the divine scales tipped in their favor. In the end, the priests of ancient Egypt were more than just religious figures. They were the power brokers, the economic giants, and the political players of their time. Behind the incense and chants, there was a web of strategy and ambition, as complex as any modern-day boardroom drama. The next time you think of ancient Egypt, remember that it wasn't just about pyramids and mummies. It was about the priests who wielded influence like a finely balanced scepter, keeping the guards and the people in line with a nod and a whisper. But let's shift the spotlight to the real MVPs of ancient Egyptian society, the scribes and artisans. While pharaohs and priests were busy playing king of the cosmic hill, these folks were the unsung heroes scribbling away in the background, making sure the whole shebang didn't collapse like a Jenga tower in a windstorm. First up, let's dive into the world of scribes, the OG data miners who were doing Excel-level calculations before anyone even knew what a spreadsheet was. Scribes were the lifeblood of Egypt's bureaucracy. Without them, the pharaoh's grand plans would have been about as effective as a chariot with square wheels. These guys were the ultimate multitaskers: tax collectors, census takers, legal clerks, and yes, riders. But calling them just riders is like saying the Great Pyramid is just a pile of rocks. These scribes kept meticulous records of everything from crop yields to military inventories. Imagine a modern-day accountant, lawyer, and journalist rolled into one, all without a single computer to save their backs. The path to becoming a scribe wasn't a walk in the park, either. It was more like a marathon through a desert of papyrus scrolls. Training began in childhood, usually around the age of 5, and involved years of learning hieroglyphs, hieratic scripts, and the art of writing on papyrus. By the end of it, they could probably draw a falcon or a beetle in their sleep. But it wasn't just about mastering calligraphy. Scribes needed a head for numbers, a keen eye for detail, and the patience of a saint. After all, they were the ones ensuring that when the pharaoh said, "Build me a new temple," the right amount of limestone ended up where it was supposed to. And what did they get in return for their years of education and labor? A pretty sweet gig, actually. Scribes held a unique position in Egyptian society. They were respected for their skills, and their work came with perks, like tax exemptions. Picture that. While everyone else was handing over their grain and cattle, scribes were the ones with their proverbial feet up, enjoying a tax-free life. Not too shabby for a kid who spent their childhood hunched over a reed pen. Now, let's bust a myth wide open. The idea that all scribes did was right. These folks were more like ancient Egypt's version of Google Analytics. They compiled data that helped manage everything from food supplies to labor force allocations. When the Nile flooded, as it did with clockwork precision, scribes were there to measure water levels and predict crop yields. They were quite literally the backbone of the Egyptian economy, ensuring that resources were allocated efficiently and effectively. So, next time someone dismisses scribes as mere scribblers, remind them that these were the people who crunched the numbers that kept Egypt's civilization ticking. But scribes weren't the only ones making waves in ancient Egypt. Enter the artisans, the craftsmen and artists who turned the pharaoh's grandiose visions into reality. These were the folks who took a block of stone and saw a sphinx, who could transform a lump of gold into a necklace fit for a queen. If scribes were the brains behind the operation, artisans were the hands that made it all happen. Artisans occupied a unique social niche. They weren't nobles, but they weren't exactly common laborers either. They lived in special communities, like Deir el-Medina, a village built specifically for the workers who constructed the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. Talk about job security. These artisans had housing, food rations, and a steady gig that lasted for generations. And while they didn't have the tax exemptions of the scribes, they enjoyed a level of respect and stability that few other professions could boast. But let's debunk another myth, the idea that artisans were just mindless laborers. These were skilled professionals who knew their craft inside and out. They had to understand geometry to plan a temple, chemistry to mix the right pigments for a fresco, and engineering to construct a pyramid that wouldn't topple over. It wasn't just about physical labor. It was about intellectual prowess. And while the pharaohs might have taken the credit for those towering statues and intricate carvings, it was the artisans who put in the elbow grease. What's more, artisans were pivotal in preserving Egyptian culture. Through their art, they told stories of gods and kings, victories and losses, the mundane and the divine. These visual narratives were a way of communicating with the masses, many of whom couldn't read. In a world without mass media, artisans were the broadcasters of their time, each chisel and brushstroke a line in the epic story of Egypt. Economically, artisans were part of a complex system of trade and patronage. They didn't just work for the state. They traded their wares in bustling marketplaces, contributing to a vibrant economy that stretched from the Mediterranean to Nubia. The goods they created were coveted, and their skills were in demand, making them integral to both local and international trade. It's safe to say that without artisans, Egypt might have been just another ancient civilization lost to the sands of time. So there you have it, scribes and artisans, the unsung heroes who kept ancient Egypt running smoothly. While pharaohs and priests might have taken center stage, it was these skilled professionals who ensured the show went on without a hitch. They weren't just cogs in the machine. They were the oil that kept those cogs turning. And as we delve deeper into the layers of Egyptian society, remember that the true story is often found not in the grand gestures of the powerful, but in the quiet, steady work of those who toil behind the scenes. Stay tuned, because we're just getting started on this journey through Egypt's social strata, and trust me, the best is yet to come. But before we crown the scribes and artisans as the ultimate champions of ancient Egypt, let's shift our gaze to the farmers and laborers, the unsung backbone of this grand civilization. Picture the scene. A scorching sun beating down on the Nile's fertile banks, where workers toiled from dawn till dusk, ensuring the land of the pharaohs thrived. These folks weren't just sweating in vain. Their efforts were the lifeblood of Egypt's economy, the silent force behind those glittering monuments we admire today. First up, the farmers. Now, these guys didn't have it easy, but they sure had their act together when it came to agriculture. The Nile's annual flood was like clockwork, a natural irrigation system long before anyone ever thought of canals. Farmers took full advantage of this, using a sophisticated system of basins and dikes to control the inundation. Imagine managing a farm where your livelihood depends on a river behaving itself. Talk about high stakes. Agriculture was the cornerstone of the Egyptian economy, with wheat and barley as its golden crops. These staples didn't just fill bellies, they also filled the state granaries, ensuring the pharaoh could play benevolent provider come tax season. And let's be clear, tax in ancient Egypt didn't mean a stern letter from the IRS. We're talking about handing over a chunk of your harvest, which the state then used to feed everyone from temple priests to pyramid builders. It's a bit like a potluck, except you're not invited to the feast. Speaking of pyramids, let's tackle one of the most persistent myths out there. The notion that these architectural wonders were built by slaves. Despite what Hollywood might lead you to believe, the builders of the pyramids were not enslaved masses cracking whips under the desert sun. Archaeological evidence, like the workers' village near the Giza pyramids, suggests they were paid laborers who received food, beer, and housing from the state. Yes, beer was part of the compensation package. Some things, like the allure of a cold brew after a long day, are truly timeless. Of course, this doesn't mean their lives were a leisurely stroll along the Nile. Laborers faced grueling conditions, with pyramid construction requiring immense manpower and organization. Imagine dragging a 2-ton stone block across sand, and you've got a typical day at the office. Yet, they were part of a highly structured system. with supervisors ensuring that each worker knew their role in the grand scheme. It was like an ancient version of a well-oiled assembly line, minus the machinery. This brings us to another crucial point, the laborers' living conditions. The workers' village, discovered at Giza, gives us a glimpse into their world. These were not shanty towns, but planned communities with bakeries, breweries, and medical facilities. Yes, you heard that right. Ancient Egyptians had a form of healthcare long before the modern world caught on. It wasn't exactly universal coverage, but for those laboring on the pharaoh's projects, it was better than nothing. The laborers weren't just nameless faces in a crowd. They had families, stories, and a sense of community. As tough as their lives were, these people took pride in their work. Their efforts were nothing short of monumental, literally. After all, these were the folks who transformed the pharaoh's visions into reality, one stone block at a time. And while they might not have had the celebrity status of their royal bosses, their contribution was no less significant. Let's not forget the women in this equation. In the agricultural sphere, women played vital roles, from managing household economies to working the fields. They were the unsung heroines, keeping the daily operations running smoothly, ensuring that food made it from the fields to the family table. And while they didn't get the recognition they deserved, their impact was woven into the fabric of everyday life. Now, back to the farmers, who were practically ancient meteorologists in their own right. They had to predict the Nile's behavior, prepare the fields, and harvest crops, all while dealing with the whims of nature. It was a delicate dance, one that required knowledge passed down through generations. And as any farmer will tell you, there's no such thing as a sure thing when it comes to agriculture. Yet, through innovation and sheer tenacity, these farmers kept the granaries full and the economy ticking over. The truth is, while pharaohs and priests were the face of ancient Egypt, it was the farmers and laborers who were its beating heart. They were the ones who fed the nation, built its wonders, and kept the wheels of civilization turning. Their lives might have been tough, but they were also indispensable, their contributions etched not in stone, but in the very survival of their society. As we continue to explore the layers of ancient Egyptian society, remember this. History isn't just about the grand gestures of a few, it's about the countless small acts of many. And in ancient Egypt, it was the farmers and laborers who carried the weight of a civilization on their sunburnt shoulders. Stay tuned, because there's more to uncover in this epic tale of ambition, resilience, and survival along the Nile. When it comes to ancient Egypt, it wasn't just the towering pyramids or the grandiloquent pharaohs that kept the desert kingdom humming along for thousands of years. It was a complex, interconnected web of social classes, each playing their part in the grand narrative. Think of it as the ultimate group project, where everyone from pharaohs to farmers had a role, and somehow they managed to get an A+ from history. Firstly, let's talk about the Nile, a river so central to Egyptian life it might as well have had its own throne. This wasn't just any body of water, it was the lifeline of the entire civilization. The annual inundation of the Nile was as predictable as a Netflix reboot, and it transformed desert into fertile farmland. This regular flooding was the backbone of Egyptian agriculture, creating a buffer against famine and providing the pharaohs with the resources to orchestrate their architectural ambitions. It's not a stretch to say that without the Nile, the grandeur of Egypt would have dried up faster than a celebrity's reputation after a Twitter controversy. Now, onto the delicate dance between power and poverty. The social hierarchy in ancient Egypt was as rigid as a pharaoh's headdress, yet it functioned with a certain efficiency. At the top, you had the pharaohs, who were basically the original influencers. Their job wasn't just to rule, but to embody mad, the cosmic balance. They needed to convince everyone, from the high priests to the humble farmers, that they were not just powerful, but divinely sanctioned. It's a bit like a modern CEO convincing the world they're not just in it for the profit, but for the good of humanity. Spoiler alert, often easier said than done. Beneath the royals were the priests and nobles, the bureaucratic backbone of the state. These folks ensured that the pharaoh's divine mandate translated into tangible governance. They were the ones running the temples, collecting taxes, and maintaining the records that kept society from descending into chaos. It was a system that required everyone to know their place, like a well-rehearsed orchestra playing a symphony that had been composed over centuries. But what about those at the bottom of the pyramid? the farmers, laborers, and artisans. They were the unsung heroes, the ones who turned the pharaoh's decrees into reality. While the pharaohs got the credit, it was these workers who ensured that the wheels of civilization kept turning. Their lives weren't easy, but they were vital. Without their labor, there would be no grand monuments or stocked granaries. They were the backbone of the economy, supporting the entire edifice of Egyptian society with their blood, sweat, and tears. And here's the kicker. Despite the rigid hierarchy, there was a sense of interdependence that kept the whole system from collapsing like a poorly constructed sandcastle. The pharaohs needed the farmers to produce surplus food, which in turn allowed the artisans to create the cultural wonders we admire today. It was a cycle of dependency that, while not exactly egalitarian, was remarkably resilient. You could say ancient Egypt was the original trickle-down economy, but with a bit more actual trickling. So, what does all this mean for us today? Well, for starters, the echoes of ancient Egypt's social structures can still be heard in our modern world. The idea of a centralized authority, supported by a complex bureaucracy and a stratified social system, is something we see in governments and corporations around the globe. And while modern society may not rely on a river to the same extent, the concept of an essential resource underpinning an entire economy is as relevant as ever. Just ask anyone who's ever paid a water bill. Take a moment to reflect on the legacy of ancient Egypt, not just the monuments or the myths, but the human stories behind them. The pharaohs might have had their names etched in stone, but it was the collective effort of an entire society that built a civilization that has fascinated us for millennia. In a world that often seems obsessed with the individual, it's worth remembering that history is rarely made by one person alone. It's the story of many, working together, each playing their part in the grand tapestry of life. So, next time you gaze upon the ruins of an ancient temple or admire the intricacies of a hieroglyph, remember the people behind the stones, the farmers, the laborers, the scribes, and the artisans. They weren't just ghosts of the past. They were real people with hopes, dreams, and ambitions, much like us. And while the sands of time may have obscured their names, their legacy lives on in the enduring story of ancient Egypt. In the end, perhaps that's the greatest lesson of all, that history is not just about the great and powerful, but about the countless individuals who, together, created a civilization that still captures our imagination today.